Let me begin by saying that for as long as I can remember, the ability to perceive spirits and otherworldly entities has run through my family like an invisible thread, tying us to the strange and supernatural. This uncanny sensitivity seems to manifest most strongly on my father's side, tracing back generations to my great-great-grandmother Esther, a formidable woman rumored to possess second sight. Family lore is rife with hushed tales of Esther's eerie premonitions, of how she could divine a person's secrets with a single penetrating look. As a child, I delighted in these stories of my spooky ancestress, begging my father to recount them over and over until I could recite them by heart. It was my father who first discovered his own psychic gift when he was just 12 years old. The way he told it, he had been exploring the dense woods behind his parents' farmhouse, following the erratic flittings of a blue morpho butterfly. The day was hot and still, the air thick with the drone of cicadas. As he pushed deeper into the green gloom, ducking under low-hanging branches festooned with lacy curtains of Spanish moss, a sudden chill prickled his spine. The hairs on his arms stood at attention, and his breath plumed before him despite the muggy heat. He froze, some primal instinct screaming danger. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, he turned his head. There, hovering between two gnarled oaks, was the translucent figure of a woman. She wore a long, old-fashioned dress, high-collared and severe. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. She stared at him across the decades with mournful, luminous eyes, her pale hands clasped before her. As he gaped in shock, she slowly raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest before shimmering out of existence like mist under the sun. Heart threatening to pound out of his chest, my father considered fleeing back to the safety of home. But curiosity and a strange magnetic pull drew him onward in the direction the specter had indicated. Barely 50 yards from where she had appeared, he stumbled into a small clearing. Sunlight filtered greenly through the leaves, dappling the forest floor in gold and shadow. And there in the center of the clearing was a small, unmarked grave. A roughly hewn wooden cross tilted drunkenly to one side, the only marker of the body laid to rest beneath the loamy earth. That was the first ghost my father ever saw, but it was far from the last. As he grew older, he learned to hone his extrasensory perception, to attune himself to the subtle energies and auras that swirled unseen around people and places. His reputation as a powerful medium spread, first in whispers through our small Ohio town, then to neighboring counties and beyond. People sought him out for spiritual guidance, to communicate with departed loved ones, to cleanse homes and businesses of negative energies. He accepted it all with calm grace and a quiet, unshakable faith in his purpose. By the time I came along, my father had fully embraced his identity as a psychic counselor and paranormal investigator. Some of my earliest memories are of strangers appearing at our front door, their eyes haunted and their voices trembling as they begged for my father's help. He always welcomed them in, listened to their stories with grave empathy, and did his best to provide aid and comfort. I would watch from the stairs, my small hands gripping the balustrade, as he would sit with them in our cozy living room, holding their hands and gazing into the distance with a look of intense concentration. Sometimes late at night, I would sneak out of bed and creep halfway down the stairs, straining to catch snatches of the adult conversations drifting up from below. The otherworldly tales I overheard thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. Banshees keening in the night, poltergeists hurling furniture, shadow figures looming in dark hallways. My child's mind transformed them into delicious horrors, campfire stories to whisper to my wide-eyed friends on muggy summer nights. But it wasn't all second-hand supernatural excitement. I had my own brushes with the unknown, fleeting moments that hinted at the psychic sensitivity I had inherited. Objects would inexplicably move overnight in my room, my favorite stuffed animals arranged in a tidy circle on the floor. Ethereal wisps, like curls of pale smoke, would dance in my peripheral vision. And then there were the dreams, vivid, intense, and saturated with eerie symbolism. I would wake panting and drenched in icy sweat, the details already evaporating in the light of dawn. It all came to a head in the summer of 1985, when I was 9 years old. We had just moved to the ramshackle old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a behemoth of weathered wood and sagging gutters set on 10 acres of sprawling woods and fields. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, the night so dark and still you could imagine you were the last person on earth. To me, it was heaven, a wild expanse to roam, trees to climb, and more freedom than I had ever known. My little sister Lily, just 7 at the time, was more hesitant about our new rural home. She missed her friends from our old neighborhood and the bustle of town. The country quiet unnerved her, the vast open spaces seeming more eerie than peaceful. She stuck close to the house those first few weeks, a small pale ghost peering out the windows. Dad, for his part, seemed energized by the move. He had a new lightness in his step, a gleam in his eye as he talked about the good energy of the place. Looking back, I suspect the isolation appealed to him, the freedom to fully engage in his unconventional work without prying eyes and wagging tongues. He could meet with clients in privacy, perform intense spiritual workings without worrying about the neighbors. I think it was that very isolation, that veil of secrecy, that allowed the darkness to take root. It began slowly, subtly, like a drop of black ink swirling into a glass of clear water. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. Creaks and groans in the night that could be attributed to the old house settling. Sudden chills that pebbled our skin, there and gone in a heartbeat. Lily, hollow-eyed and listless, pushing her breakfast around her plate without eating. Then came the whispering, soft, sibilant, like leaves skittering across a cold ground. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, the empty spaces in the shadows. I would freeze, straining to make out words in the white noise hiss. It never rose above a murmur, but it filled me with formless dread, a bone-deep certainty that the whispers harbored ancient malice. When I finally worked up the courage to mention it to Dad, he frowned, that familiar crease appearing between his eyebrows. He tilted his head as if listening for something beyond the range of normal human hearing. After a long, taut moment, his shoulders relaxed and he smiled reassuringly. "It's nothing to worry about, son. Just the spirit of a little girl making her presence known. She drowned in the pond out back decades ago, poor thing. But she means no harm. She's just a bit of a trickster, that's all." I wanted to believe him. I clung to the comfort of his words like a life raft in the chilly sea of my own fear. And for a while it worked. Dad's calm confidence was a balm, his explanations a candle in the dark. We even gave the spirit a cute nickname, Abby, short for Abigail. Abby's shenanigans were unsettling but relatively innocuous at first. Lights would flicker and dim, bulbs burning out with startling regularity. Our milk would spoil overnight, souring in the fridge despite the cold. Doors would open and shut themselves, their hinges shrieking like damned souls. It became a macabre sort of routine, just another quirk of our eccentric home. But as the sticky Ohio summer crept on, Abby's tricks took on a sharper edge. Lily's dolls would end up arranged in disturbing tableaus, their glassy eyes staring accusingly from high shelves. Angry welts would appear on our skin as we slept, vivid red scratches like the marks of small fingernails. And over it all hung the cloying stench of stagnant water, the thick scent of the pond on a breezeless day. Through it all, Dad remained unflappable, his faith in his spectral abilities absolute. When I came to him in near tears after a particularly vicious nightmare, he gathered me into a tight hug and stroked my hair. "Abby's just trying to get attention, kiddo, like any child acting out. We have to show her love and understanding. Prove that we're not scared of her. She'll come around, you'll see." I nodded against his chest, breathing in the comforting scent of his aftershave. I wanted so badly for him to be right. But deep in my young bones, an ancestral knowing whispered that something was very, very wrong. Everything came to a terrifying head on a sweltering night in late August. The air was thick and soupy, the crickets and frogs symphonic in the darkness. I lay restless atop sweat-damp sheets, the old box fan in the window providing little relief. Tossing and turning, I tried to ignore the uneasiness trickling along my nerves like icy fingers. The clock ticked over to 3 a.m., the witching hour. At that precise moment, an ungodly scream tore through the house. It was high and ragged with terror. A woman's voice on the ragged edge of sanity. My blood turned to ice in my veins. It was coming from Lily's room. I was out of bed in an instant, my bare feet slapping against the worn wood floors. I burst through Lily's door, heart lodged somewhere in my throat. My sister was sitting bolt upright in bed, her dark hair plastered to her forehead in lank strands. Her eyes were huge in the pale oval of her face, stark terror in every line of her small body. "Lily, what's wrong? What happened?" My words came out high and panicky, my breath sawing in my throat. Slowly, tremulously, she raised a quivering hand and pointed to the far corner of the room. I followed the line of her finger, a leaden weight settling in my gut. There, crouched in the gloom where the feeble moonlight failed to reach, was a shape. It was vaguely human in outline, but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long and its head bulbous and misshapen. As I stared in horrified fascination, it unfolded from its contorted crouch with a liquid, boneless grace that turned my stomach. It seemed to absorb the darkness around it like a stain spreading in reverse. Then, as if sensing my gaze, its head snapped up with a cracking speed that defied physics. 2 pinprick points of baleful red light glared out of the writhing shadows of its face, piercing me to the core. Malevolence and a terrible ancient hunger rolled off the thing in palpable waves, pressing down on my mind like the crushing pressure in the deep ocean. I opened my mouth to scream for my father, but my throat was paralyzed, my lungs seized in bands of ice. I could only stand rooted to the spot in mute horror as the entity slowly unfurled to its full, imposing height. The shadows peeled away from it like flayed skin, revealing pallid, grayish flesh stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Straggles of lank, dark hair hung in a parody of a child's style. But it was the eyes that shattered me. Crimson wells of inhuman rage and bottomless sorrow. No child's eyes had ever looked like that, held that fathomless well of despair. It took a single gliding step towards us, its movements jerky and puppet-like. That was all it took to break the spell holding me immobile. Galvanized by pure primal terror, I grabbed Lily's icy hand and ran, yanking her behind me hard enough to draw a yelp. We flew down the dark hall to our parents' room, literally falling through the door. Dad was already up, his face lined with concern in the glow of the bedside lamp. Mom, her dark hair tumbling around her shoulders, clutched the quilt with white-knuckled fingers. "What in the world?" Dad started, but his words cut off as he registered our wild eyes, the stark fear etched into every line of our bodies. "It's Abby," I gasped out. "But she's not. She's not right, Dad. That thing in Lily's room, it's not human. It's evil. It's..." My voice cracked and dissolved on a sob. Lily pressed against my side, small and shaking. Dad's face hardened, a steely resolve settling over his features. He turned to my mother, some wordless communication passing between them. "Stay with the kids," he said grimly, already moving towards the door. For the first time I could remember, real fear shadowed his eyes. It made him look older, more vulnerable. Just a man, not the unshakable pillar of strength I had always seen him as. Mom wrapped her arms around us as Dad slipped from the room, a sense of something momentous and terrible looming in the musty air. I remember the sound of his footsteps receding down the hall, the creak of the floorboards like bones straining under a malignant weight. The silence that followed was a heavy, watchful thing, gravid with unspeakable possibilities. 1 minute became 2, then 5, then 10. The night pressed close, a smothering black void hungering to consume us. I shivered in my mother's embrace, chilled to the marrow despite the sticky heat. When the scream came, it was a blade straight to the heart. High and agonized, it ripped through the deathly hush like a serrated knife. I will never forget that sound, the sheer animal pain and terror of it. It was my father's voice, but twisted into something raw and unrecognizable. Mom was already moving, shoving us behind her and scrabbling frantically in the bedside drawer. Her hand emerged, clutching a small silver crucifix, the metal winking coldly in the lamplight. Lips moving in soundless prayer, she advanced towards the door, her entire body trembling like a leaf in a gale, and the darkness answered. A frigid wind howled through the house, rattling the windows in their frames and slamming doors with a violence that shook the very foundations. The temperature plummeted with a startling abruptness, our breaths pluming before us in panicked puffs. Shadows writhed along the walls, taking on grotesque shapes that gibbered and danced in the flickering light. The stench of rot and fetid water rose like a miasma, clogging the back of my throat with cloying sweetness. Despair crashed over me in a black wave, the bone-deep certainty that all hope was lost, that we were tiny, insignificant creatures caught in the maw of something vast and utterly malign. In that moment of soul-crushing hopelessness, as the darkness closed in like a fist and the unearthly screams of my father echoed in my ears, something shifted inside me. A small, bright spark of defiance kindled to life in my chest, a stubborn flicker that refused to be snuffed out. It was the ember at the core of me, the inherited strength of my father and his father before him, a legacy of those who stared into the abyss and refused to blink. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I grabbed the silver crucifix from my mother's numb fingers. Its weight was reassuring in my palm, the metal warming to my touch. I squared my narrow shoulders and stepped towards the roiling mass of shadows blocking the door, heart pounding a war drum in my chest. "Leave us alone!" The words tore out of me in a ragged shout, my voice cracking with the force of my terror and desperate bravery. "You're not welcome here, Abby, or whatever you are. This is our home, and you can't have it or us." I thrust the crucifix out before me, my small hand shaking but resolute. For a moment, the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears and the rasp of my rapid breaths. The shadows stilled, the unnatural wind dying as suddenly as it had risen. Then, like oil fleeing from water, the darkness began to recede. It peeled back from the walls and door, slinking away into the far corners of the room. As it withdrew, as the darkness receded, I caught a glimpse of what lay beyond the door, out in the hallway. My father lay crumpled against the far wall, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. Blood matted his hair and pooled beneath him in a dark, viscous puddle. For a moment, the world tilted dizzyingly on its axis, and I thought I might pass out. But then I saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the flutter of his eyelids, and relief crashed through me like a tidal wave. He was alive. Badly hurt, but alive. In that moment, the last of the shadows vanished, taking with them the unnatural cold and the reek of stagnant water. The house was still and quiet, the only sound the ragged sawing of our collective breathing. I realized I was still holding the crucifix before me, my knuckles white around its silver length. Slowly, hardly daring to believe it was truly over, I lowered my trembling arm. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, urgent voices, and the acrid scent of antiseptic. Paramedics, police, a horde of grim-faced men in dark suits who spoke in low, clipped tones. Through it all, we huddled together in shocked silence, watching our cozy world come undone at the seams. In the end, there was no tidy explanation. No easy answers to wrap up the horror in a neat bow. The official report spoke of a disturbed transient, a tragic home invasion with an almost supernatural edge. But we knew the truth, a truth too dark and strange for the harsh light of day. In the weeks that followed, as Dad recovered from his injuries and we struggled to pick up the tattered pieces of our lives, I threw myself into research with a fervor bordering on obsession. Long nights in the library, poring over dusty tomes and faded newspaper clippings, seeking any scrap of information about the history of our land, the restless spirits that called it home. What I uncovered chilled me to the bone. Tales of settlers vanishing without a trace, of dark rituals and blood-soaked soil, whispers of a malevolent entity older than human memory, a darkness that hungered for the innocent. And threading through it all, a familiar theme, a little girl, dark-haired and doomed, her tragic fate forever binding her to this cursed place. With each new revelation, the icy claws of dread sank deeper into my heart. I knew with a grim, unshakable certainty that our ordeal was far from over. The evil we had faced was merely a harbinger, a taste of the darkness to come. It had marked us, claimed us in some fundamental way, and it would never let us go. But even as despair threatened to consume me, I clung to the memory of that small, defiant spark that had ignited within me in our darkest hour. The legacy of my father's courage, the stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. I knew that wherever this twisted path might lead, whatever fresh horrors lay in wait, we would face them as we always had. Together, as a family, drawing strength from the unbreakable bonds of blood and love. Our battle was just beginning, but we would not face it alone. In the coming years, as I honed my abilities and delved ever deeper into the world of the unseen, I would find others like myself, gifted, cursed, bound by the eternal struggle against the forces of darkness. Together we would stand as a light in the shadows, a bulwark against the hungry void that sought to consume us all. The road ahead was long and shrouded in uncertainty, but I knew one thing with bone-deep conviction. Whatever trials lay in store, whatever sacrifices demanded, I would never stop fighting. For my father, for Lily, for the innocent, and the lost. I would take up the mantle passed down through generations, the sacred duty to defend the living from the depredations of the dead. I was a child no longer, but a soldier in an ancient war. My weapons would be salt and silver, sage and blessed steel. My strength, the love and faith of those who stood beside me. And though the darkness might press close, though the night seem endless and filled with teeth, I would never forget the lesson of that fateful summer. Even in the deepest shadows, there is always a spark of light, a glimmer of hope, fragile yet indomitable. And it is from these sparks that the greatest fires are born, the cleansing flames that chase the darkness back and remind us of who we are, children of the sun, unbowed and unafraid. The winter of 2018 had been particularly harsh in northern Quebec. As a lifelong resident of the small town of Frostholm, I'd seen my fair share of brutal winters, but this one seemed determined to set records. The snow piled up in drifts taller than houses, and the wind howled through the pine forests with a voice that seemed almost alive. My name is Marcus LeBlanc, and I've called this frozen corner of the world home for all of my 32 years. There's a certain pride that comes with surviving in a place where nature seems constantly intent on reminding you of your own insignificance. It breeds a particular type of person, tough, self-reliant, and perhaps a bit wary of outsiders. It was against this backdrop of endless white and biting cold that my friend Ethan Tremblay and I decided to embark on what should have been a routine ice fishing trip. Ethan and I had been friends since childhood, bonding over our shared love of the outdoors and the unique challenges that come with living in the far north. You ready for this, Marcus? Ethan asked, as he loaded the last of our gear into his sturdy SUV. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and his beard was already accumulating a layer of frost. I nodded, adjusting my thick woolen hat. Born ready. Let's see if we can't bring home enough walleye to feed the whole town. We set out early on a Friday morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as we left the lights of Frostholm behind. Our destination was Lake Silvermoon, a vast expanse of water that, in the grip of winter, transformed into a frozen plain perfect for ice fishing. The drive took us through dense forests of pine and spruce, their branches heavy with snow. We chatted easily as we drove, discussing everything from local gossip to the latest hockey scores. It was the kind of comfortable conversation that only comes from years of friendship. Heard anything more about those strange animal attacks out near Old Miller's farm? I asked, remembering a conversation I'd overheard at the local diner a few days earlier. Ethan shrugged, his eyes never leaving the snow-covered road. Just rumors, I reckon. You know how people get this time of year. Cabin fever makes folks see all sorts of things that aren't there. I nodded, but couldn't shake a feeling of unease. There had been an increasing number of stories circulating about livestock found mutilated in ways that didn't match any known predator. Some of the old-timers in town had started muttering about things best left alone, their eyes darting nervously as if afraid of being overheard. We arrived at Lake Silvermoon just as the sun had fully risen, casting an ethereal glow across the vast expanse of ice. The lake stretched out before us, a blank white canvas interrupted only by the occasional ice fishing hut dotting its surface. Looks like we've got the place mostly to ourselves, Ethan observed as we unloaded our gear. Must be our lucky day. If only we had known then how wrong he was. We spent the morning setting up our spot, drilling holes in the thick ice and setting up our portable shelter against the biting wind. By early afternoon, we had settled into the comfortable rhythm of ice fishing. Periods of quiet concentration interspersed with friendly banter and the occasional celebratory whoop when one of us landed a particularly impressive catch. As the short winter day began to wane, our cooler was pleasantly full of fish. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, reflecting off the ice in a spectacle that never failed to take my breath away. We should think about heading back soon, I said reluctantly. As much as I loved being out here, I knew the dangers of being caught out after dark in this unforgiving landscape. Ethan nodded, beginning to pack up our gear. Yeah, you're right. Sarah will have my head if I'm not back in time for dinner. Besides, I think we've more than proven our fishing prowess for one day. We loaded everything back into Ethan's SUV, our spirits high from a successful day on the ice. As we pulled away from the lake, neither of us could have imagined the terror that awaited us on the journey home, a journey that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the world and our place in it. The first sign that something was amiss came about halfway through our drive back to Frostholm. The sky, which had been clear all day, suddenly darkened as ominous clouds rolled in from the north. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with an almost mournful sound. This doesn't look good, Ethan muttered, leaning forward to peer through the windshield at the rapidly deteriorating conditions. Weather report didn't say anything about a storm. I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Winter storms in this part of the world were not to be taken lightly. They could appear seemingly out of nowhere and turn deadly in a matter of minutes. Maybe we should turn back? I suggested, eyeing the rapidly accumulating snow on the road. Ethan shook his head. We're closer to Frostholm than the lake at this point. Best to push on and get home. I nodded, knowing he was right, but unable to shake the feeling that we were driving into something far worse than just a winter storm. As we crested a steep hill, the headlights of Ethan's SUV illuminated a scene that made both of us gasp in shock. There, blocking the entire width of the narrow highway, were two police helicopters. Their rotors were still, and a small group of officers were gathered nearby, their faces grim. "What the hell?" Ethan exclaimed, bringing the vehicle to a stop. We watched as one of the officers approached our vehicle, his hand resting cautiously on his holster. As he drew closer, I recognized him as Sergeant Bouchard, a veteran of the local police force. "Evening, boys," he said as Ethan rolled down the window. The wind howled, carrying with it stinging particles of snow. "I'm afraid you'll have to turn back. Roads closed." "What happened?" I asked, leaning across Ethan to make myself heard over the wind. Sergeant Bouchard's face darkened. "Nasty accident. Young couple in a car collided with a transport truck. It's not pretty." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. The implication was clear. There had been fatalities. "How long until the road's clear?" Ethan asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The sergeant shook his head. "Hard to say. Could be 12 hours, maybe more. This storm isn't helping matters. You boys best find somewhere to hole up for the night." With heavy hearts, we turned the SUV around and headed back the way we'd come. The storm was intensifying, the wind throwing snow against the windshield with increasing fury. "What now?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There's that old mining town, Whispering Pines. It's not far from here. Might be able to find a place to wait out the storm there." I nodded, remembering the near ghost town we'd passed on our way to the lake. It wasn't much, but it was better than being stuck out here in the storm. As we drove, the world outside became a swirling mass of white. The headlights of the SUV seemed to be swallowed up by the snow, barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead. The tension in the vehicle was palpable, both of us acutely aware of how quickly a simple drive could turn deadly in these conditions. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes, we saw the faint glow of lights ahead. Whispering Pines loomed out of the darkness, a collection of old buildings huddled together against the storm. As we entered the town, an eerie sight greeted us. The snow was so deep that only the pointed rooftops of the houses were visible, the rest completely submerged in white. It was as if we had entered a bizarre, half-buried world. "Jesus," Ethan muttered, slowing the SUV to a crawl. "I've never seen anything like this." We made our way through the silent, snow-covered streets, eventually finding what appeared to be the town's only motel. It was an old two-story building with a flickering neon sign that read, "Pine Rest Inn." As we pulled into the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced around, but saw nothing but swirling snow and the vague shapes of buried buildings. "Come on," Ethan said, killing the engine. "Let's get inside before we freeze to death." Little did we know as we hurried through the howling wind towards the motel's entrance that our ordeal was only just beginning. The true terror that awaited us in Whispering Pines would make the storm outside seem like a gentle summer breeze in comparison. The Pine Rest Inn looked like it had seen better days, even accounting for the near-apocalyptic amounts of snow burying most of it. As Ethan and I pushed through the front door, a bell jangled discordantly, announcing our presence to the empty lobby. The interior was dimly lit and had the musty smell of a place that didn't see much use. Faded wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the carpet beneath our feet was worn thin in places. Behind a scarred wooden desk, an ancient television flickered silently, casting an eerie blue glow across the room. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Anyone here?" For a long moment there was no response. Then from a back room we heard the sound of shuffling footsteps. A door creaked open, and an old man emerged, blinking at us in surprise. "Visitors?" he croaked, his voice rough as if from disuse. "Don't get many of those, especially not in weather like this." He introduced himself as Gerald, the owner and sole employee of the Pine Rest Inn. As he checked us in, insisting on using an old paper ledger rather than any kind of computer system. I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "You boys be careful now," Gerald said as he handed us our room key. Strange things happen in Whispering Pines when the snow gets this deep. Best to stay inside after dark. Ethan and I exchanged glances. It was the kind of warning that would have seemed comically ominous in a movie, but here, in this near-abandoned town buried in snow, it sent a shiver down my spine. Our room was on the second floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. Like the lobby, it had seen better days. 2 twin beds with faded floral bedspreads dominated the space, along with a dresser that had definitely been outdated when Gerald was a young man. "Well, it's not the Ritz," Ethan said with a wry smile as he dropped his bag on one of the beds. "But it beats freezing to death in the car." I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been growing since we entered the town. Something about this place felt off. It was more than just the abandoned buildings or the mountain of snow. There was a palpable sense of wrongness in the air, as if the very fabric of reality was slightly askew here. We spent the rest of the evening in our room, munching on the snacks we'd brought for our fishing trip and listening to the wind howl outside. The storm showed no signs of abating, and we resigned ourselves to the fact that we'd likely be stuck here until morning at least. As night fell, the already dim light outside faded to an impenetrable blackness. The ancient heating system in our room rattled and clanked, struggling against the intense cold. Despite the less than ideal conditions, exhaustion from our long day eventually caught up with us, and we decided to turn in for the night. I'm not sure how long I slept before the sound woke me. At first I thought it was just the wind, which had been a constant background noise since we arrived. But as I lay there in the darkness, I realized this was something different. It was a voice, or voices, carried on the wind. They were too faint to make out words, but the sound sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something wrong about those voices. They didn't sound human. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to hear better. Beside me, I could hear Ethan's steady breathing, still fast asleep. "Ethan," I whispered, reaching out to shake his shoulder. "Ethan, wake up." He stirred groggily. "What is it?" he mumbled. "Listen," I said. "Do you hear that?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, just as I was beginning to think I had imagined it, the sound came again. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ethan sat bolt upright. "What the hell is that?" he hissed. Before I could answer, a new sound cut through the night, a scream. It was unmistakably human, filled with terror and pain. It seemed to be coming from somewhere outside the motel. We were both out of bed in an instant, rushing to the window. The world outside was a sea of white, the snow still falling heavily. At first I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Then movement caught my eye. A figure was stumbling through the snow, moving away from the motel. Even from this distance, I could tell something was wrong with the way it moved. Jerky, uncoordinated, as if it was being puppeteered by an unskilled hand. As we watched, horrified, another figure emerged from the swirling snow behind the first. This one moved differently, smooth, predatory. It was gaining on the stumbling figure quickly. "We have to help," Ethan said, already moving towards the door. I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said, my voice shaking. "Look." The second figure had caught up to the first. What happened next? I still have trouble believing, even though I saw it with my own eyes. The predator seemed to change. It grew larger, its form shifting and contorting in ways that should have been impossible. In the dim light, I caught a glimpse of razor-sharp claws and a muzzle filled with gleaming teeth. The scream that followed would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Ethan and I stood frozen at the window, unable to look away from the horrific scene unfolding before us. When it was over, the transformed creature, for I couldn't think of it as anything else, turned and looked directly at our window. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes glowing an unnatural red in the darkness. For a moment that stretched into eternity, it stared at us. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the swirling snow. Ethan and I looked at each other, our faces pale with shock and fear. Whatever was out there in the night, whatever had just happened, we both knew one thing for certain. Our lives would never be the same again. Dawn broke over whispering pines, the pale light of the sun struggling to penetrate the thick cloud cover. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The snow lay in drifts taller than a man, with only the occasional rooftop or treetop breaking the endless expanse of white. Ethan and I had barely slept after what we'd witnessed in the night. We spent the early hours of the morning huddled in our room, speaking in hushed voices about what we had seen. Neither of us could quite believe it, yet we couldn't deny the evidence of our own eyes. "We need to tell someone," Ethan said for what felt like the 100th time. "The police, the rangers, someone?" I shook my head. "And tell them what? That we saw some kind of monster attack someone in the middle of a snowstorm? They'll think we're crazy, or drunk, or both." Before Ethan could argue further, a commotion from outside caught our attention. We rushed to the window to see a battered pickup truck pulling into the motel parking lot. It was the first sign of life we'd seen in the town since our arrival. A man stepped out of the truck, and even from a distance I could tell he was unlike anyone I'd ever seen in Frostholm or the surrounding areas. He was tall and lean, with a shock of red hair that stood out starkly against the white landscape. But it was the way he moved that really caught my attention. Purposeful, alert, like a predator scanning for prey. "Come on," I said to Ethan, already moving towards the door. "Let's go see what's going on." We made our way down to the lobby, where we found Gerald in an animated conversation with the newcomer. As we approached, I could hear snatches of their discussion. "Third one this month, Gerald," the red-haired man was saying, his voice low and intense. "We can't keep ignoring this." Gerald shook his head, his eyes darting nervously to where Ethan and I stood. "Not now, Remy," he muttered. "We have guests." The man, Remy, turned to face us, his piercing green eyes seeming to look right through us. "Guests, eh?" he said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Bit of an odd time for a vacation, isn't it?" Ethan stepped forward, extending his hand. "I'm Ethan, and this is Marcus," he said. "We got caught in the storm last night. Our cars snowed in." Remy shook Ethan's hand, his grip firm. "Remy Beauchamp," he introduced himself. "Local hunter and problem solver, you might say." There was something in the way he said problem solver that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that Remy knew more about what was going on in this town than he was letting on. "Actually," I said, deciding to take a chance, "we saw something last night. Something strange." Remy's eyes sharpened with interest. "Strange how?" I glanced at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, I recounted what we had witnessed the previous night. The inhuman sounds, the chase through the snow, and the terrifying transformation we'd seen. As I spoke, Remy's expression grew increasingly serious. When I finished, he turned to Gerald with a grim look. "You see," he said, "it's getting bolder. We need to act now before more people get hurt." Gerald looked like he wanted to argue, but instead just sagged, suddenly looking every one of his years. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Remy's hand went to his belt, and for the first time, I noticed the large hunting knife sheathed there. "What we should have done years ago," he said. "Hunt it down and end this, once and for all." He turned back to Ethan and me. "You boys know how to handle yourselves in the woods. Ethan and I exchanged glances. We were both experienced outdoorsmen. You had to be living this far north. But this was something else entirely. We can hold our own, Ethan said cautiously. But what exactly are we dealing with here? Remy's eyes gleamed with a mix of excitement and something darker. Fear, perhaps? Something that shouldn't exist, he said. Something that's been preying on this town for generations. The old-timers call it the Wendigo. The name sent a chill through me. I'd heard stories of the Wendigo growing up, a malevolent spirit of the northern forests, associated with winter famine and forbidden acts. But those were just stories, campfire tales to scare children, weren't they? You can't be serious, I said, even as the memory of what I'd seen the night before flashed through my mind. Remy's face was grim. I've never been more serious in my life, he said. This thing has been terrorizing Whispering Pines for as long as anyone can remember. It's time we put an end to it. He looked at each of us in turn. I could use some help, he said. Extra eyes, extra hands. It's dangerous, I won't lie to you. But if we don't stop this thing, more people will die. I wanted to refuse. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get in our car and drive as far away from this cursed town as possible. But then I thought of the figure we'd seen being chased last night, the scream that had echoed through the darkness. Could I really walk away, knowing what was out there? Ethan must have been thinking along the same lines. We're in, he said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. Remy nodded, a grim smile on his face. Good, he said. We leave in an hour. Pack warm and pack anything you think might be useful in a fight. We're not coming back until this is over, one way or another. As Ethan and I headed back to our room to prepare, my mind was reeling. How had a simple ice fishing trip turned into this? A hunt for a mythical monster in a town that seemed to exist outside of normal reality? Little did I know this was just the beginning. The horrors that awaited us in the frozen wilderness would test not just our survival skills, but our very sanity, and not all of us would make it back alive. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Ethan and I gathered every piece of warm clothing we had, layering up until we could barely move. We raided the small general store attached to the motel for additional supplies, extra batteries, energy bars, first aid supplies, anything we thought might give us an edge in the frozen wilderness we were about to enter. Remy met us in the parking lot, his truck idling, exhaust forming thick clouds in the frigid air. He'd changed into what looked like professional-grade winter gear, and the bed of his truck was loaded with equipment, snowshoes, climbing gear, and what looked suspiciously like heavy-duty animal traps. But it was the gun case he was carefully loading into the cab that really caught my attention. "What's that?" I asked, nodding towards it. Remy's face was grim as he secured the case. "Insurance," he said simply. "Let's hope we don't need it." As we climbed into the truck, I couldn't help but notice the way Gerald watched us from the motel doorway. The old man's face was a mask of worry, and was that guilt? Before I could ponder it further, Remy gunned the engine, and we were off, plowing through the deep snow towards the edge of town. The world outside the truck's windows was a study in white. The storm had transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful, the familiar contours of the land smoothed and softened by the deep blanket of snow. In other circumstances, I might have found it breathtaking. Now it just felt ominous, as if the very land was conspiring to hide the horrors that lurked within it. We drove in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, as we turned onto a narrow road that led into the dense pine forest that surrounded Whispering Pines, Ethan spoke up. "So, Remy," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed tension, "you want to tell us more about what we're up against?" Remy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the snowy road ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. The Wendigo, he began, is more than just a monster. It's a curse, a spirit of hunger and winter. The stories say it was once human, transformed by an act of cannibalism in a time of desperate hunger. I felt my stomach turn at the thought. Remy continued, seemingly oblivious to our discomfort. Now it roams these woods, always hungry, always hunting. It can mimic human voices, lure its prey in. And anyone it kills, they become like it. A never-ending cycle of hunger and violence. But how do we kill it? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Remy's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That's the tricky part, he said. Regular weapons won't do much. You have to destroy the heart, completely. Fire works best, or silver if you can get it deep enough. He glanced at us, his green eyes hard. But the most important thing, don't let it bite you. Don't let it wound you at all if you can help it. The curse, it spreads, like a disease. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. I thought back to the figure we'd seen being chased the night before. Had that been a person, already infected? The thought made me shudder. We drove on in silence after that, the weight of our task settling over us like a shroud. The forest grew denser around us, the trees pressing close to the narrow road. More than once, Remy had to stop to clear fallen branches from our path. It was during one of these stops that we heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. It sounded like a wolf, but wrong somehow. Too deep, too human. Remy was back in the truck in an instant, his face pale. It knows we're here, he said, his voice tight. We need to move. Now! He gunned the engine, the truck lurching forward through the snow. The howl came again, closer this time, much closer. There! Ethan suddenly shouted, pointing out the passenger window. I turned just in time to see a dark shape flit between the trees, moving far too fast for its size. For a brief moment I caught a glimpse of glowing red eyes and razor-sharp teeth. Remy swore, swerving the truck sharply. The tires lost traction on the snow-covered road, and suddenly we were sliding, the world outside the windows spinning crazily. There was a sickening crunch of metal, a jolt that sent us all lurching forward against our seatbelts. Then, stillness. The engine sputtered and died. For a long moment, none of us moved. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the soft hiss of snow falling on the truck's crumpled hood. Everyone okay? Remy finally asked, his voice tight with pain. Ethan and I mumbled affirmatives, though my head was spinning and I could taste blood where I'd bitten my lip. We need to move, Remy said, already reaching for the door handle. It'll be on us any minute. As if in response to his words, that terrible howl split the air again. It was close. Too close. We scrambled out of the truck, Remy pausing only long enough to grab the gun case and a backpack of supplies. The cold hit me like a physical blow as soon as I stepped outside, the wind cutting through my layers of clothing. This way, Remy said, gesturing towards a barely visible trail leading deeper into the forest. There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles from here. If we can make it there, we might have a chance. As we set off into the trees, the snow crunching under our boots and the wind howling through the branches above, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, hunted. The Wendigo was out there, somewhere in the white wilderness. And we were no longer the hunters. We were the prey. The trek through the snow-laden forest was grueling. Every step was a battle against the deep snow and the biting wind that seemed to cut right through our layers of clothing. Remy led the way, his movements purposeful despite the obvious pain he was in from the crash. Ethan and I followed, constantly scanning the trees around us for any sign of movement. The howls had stopped, but somehow that was even more unnerving. The forest was too quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. How much further? Ethan gasped after what felt like hours of trudging through the snow. Remy paused, consulting a battered compass. Should be just over this ridge, he said, gesturing to a steep incline ahead of us. Come on, we're almost there. As we began to climb, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every crack of a branch in the wind made me flinch. The stories Remy had told us about the Wendigo's ability to mimic voices kept replaying in my mind. How could we trust anything we heard out here? We were about halfway up the ridge when we heard it. A child's voice calling out from somewhere in the forest behind us. Help, please, someone help me. Ethan froze, turning towards the sound. We have to go back, he said, his face pale. There's a kid out there. Remy's hand shot out, grabbing Ethan's arm before he could move. It's not a child, he said, his voice low and urgent. It's the Wendigo. It's trying to lure us back. As if to confirm his words, the voice called out again, but this time it changed mid-cry, shifting from a child's plea to a guttural growl that was barely human. Run! Remy shouted, giving us a push to get us moving. We scrambled up the ridge, all pretense of stealth forgotten in our desperation to reach the cabin. I could hear something moving through the forest behind us, branches snapping under its weight. Just as I thought my lungs would burst from the effort, we crested the top of the ridge. There, nestled in a small clearing, was the trapper's cabin. It was a small, squat building made of rough-hewn logs, but in that moment, it looked like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Remy reached the door first, fumbling with a key. Come on, he muttered as Ethan and I reached the small porch. Finally, the lock turned. We tumbled inside, Remy slamming the door behind us and quickly throwing the bolt. For a long moment we all stood there, gasping for breath, listening intently for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing, just the wind whistling around the eaves of the cabin. What now? I finally asked, once I had enough breath to speak. Remy was already moving, checking the cabin's small windows. Now we prepare, he said grimly. It knows where we are. It'll come for us sooner or later. The interior of the cabin was sparse but functional. A small wood stove dominated one wall, with a stack of firewood beside it. A rough wooden table and chairs sat in the center of the room, and a ladder led up to a small loft area. Gun racks lined one wall, though they were empty now. Remy set his gun case on the table, flipping it open to reveal a high-powered rifle. Silver bullets, he explained as he began to load the weapon. Not easy to come by and expensive as hell, but they'll do the job if we can hit it in the heart. He looked up at us, his face serious. I've got some extra rounds, but we need to make every shot count. You boys ever fired a rifle before? Ethan and I both nodded. Growing up in the North, we'd both learned to hunt at a young age, but somehow, I didn't think shooting deer or moose was quite the same as facing down a mythical monster. As Remy gave us a crash course in the finer points of Wendigo hunting, I found my mind wandering, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. How had a simple ice fishing trip turned into this? Part of me still couldn't quite believe it was real. Maybe I was hallucinating, driven mad by the cold and the isolation. But the weight of the rifle in my hands felt real enough, as did the fear that churned in my gut. Night fell quickly, the already dim forest plunging into an inky blackness that seemed to press against the cabin's windows. We took turns keeping watch, peering out into the darkness for any sign of movement. It was during my watch in the deepest part of the night that I saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Then, emerging from the shadows, a figure that made my blood run cold. It was vaguely humanoid, but stretched and distorted in ways that defied natural law. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in wickedly sharp claws that gleamed in the moonlight. But it was the face that truly horrified me. A twisted, elongated visage with sunken eyes that glowed an unearthly red, and a mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth. For a moment I was frozen in terror, unable to move or even breathe. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the creature's head snapped towards the cabin. Those glowing eyes seemed to bore right through me, and I knew with certainty that it saw me. "Remy," I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, it's here!" They were beside me in an instant, rifles at the ready. Remy's face went pale as he saw the creature, but his hands were steady on his weapon. "Remember," he said, his voice low and tense, "aim for the heart, and whatever happens, don't let it touch you." The Wendigo seemed to hesitate at the edge of the clearing, as if weighing its options. Then, with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something its size, it charged towards the cabin. "Now!" Remy shouted, and we opened fire. The sound of gunshots was deafening in the small cabin. I saw the creature jerk and stumble as bullets tore into it, but it kept coming. It reached the cabin in seconds, its claws raking across the wooden walls with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. "The door!" Ethan yelled. "It's going for the door!" Sure enough, the creature had moved out of our line of sight, and we could hear it scrabbling at the cabin's only entrance. The sturdy wood groaned under the assault. Remy was already moving, positioning himself in front of the door with his rifle aimed and ready. "When it comes through," he said, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes, "hit it with everything you've got." The tension was unbearable. We could hear the creature's ragged breathing, the scrape of its claws against the wood. Then, with a splintering crash, the door burst inward. The Wendigo filled the doorway, its massive form hunched to fit through the opening. Up close, the stench of it was overwhelming, a sickly, sweet odor of decay that made my stomach churn. Remy fired first, the sound of the shot impossibly loud in the confined space. The creature roared in pain and anger, a sound that was more felt than heard, vibrating in my bones. Ethan and I added our fire to Remy's, the cabin filled with muzzle flashes and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The Wendigo thrashed and howled, black ichor spraying from its wounds, but it kept coming. With a swipe of its massive clawed hand, it sent Remy flying across the room. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor, unmoving. "Remy!" Ethan shouted, but there was no time to check on him. The Wendigo was fully inside the cabin now, its massive form seeming to fill the entire space. I emptied my rifle into the creature's chest, praying that at least one of the silver bullets would find its mark. The Wendigo staggered, its glowing eyes flickering, and for a moment I dared to hope that we had done it. Then its gaze fixed on me, and I saw something there that chilled me to my core. Intelligence, and a malevolent hunger that went beyond mere physical need. This thing wasn't just a beast acting on instinct. It was evil, ancient, and patient, and it wanted more than just our flesh. It lunged for me faster than I could react. I felt a searing pain across my chest as its claws raked through my layers of clothing and into my skin. The force of the blow sent me sprawling backwards, my head cracking against the edge of the table. Through a haze of pain and encroaching darkness, I saw Ethan grab a burning log from the wood stove and thrust it at the creature. The Wendigo recoiled with an ear-splitting shriek, its flesh sizzling where the flames touched it. That was the last thing I saw before unconsciousness claimed me. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the pain, a throbbing ache in my head and a fiery line of agony across my chest. Then I became aware of voices, arguing in hushed but heated tones. "Can't just leave him here." That was Ethan's voice, tense with fear and anger. "We might not have a choice." Remy, his voice rough with pain. "You saw those claw marks. If he's infected." "He's not. He can't be." Ethan again, desperation clear in his voice. I forced my eyes open, wincing at the dim light of the cabin. "I'm not dead yet," I managed to croak out. They were at my side in an instant. Ethan's face was pale and drawn, a nasty cut above his eye still oozing blood. Remy looked even worse, one arm hanging limply at his side and a dark bruise spreading across half his face. "How do you feel?" Ethan asked, helping me sit up. "Like I got hit by a truck," I groaned. "What happened?" "The Wendigo." "You got lucky," Remy said, his eyes scanning me warily. "Its claws caught you, but the wounds aren't deep. Ethan managed to drive it off with fire, but it'll be back. They always come back." I looked down at my chest, where bandages were visible through my torn clothing. Am I going to turn into one of those things?" I asked, voicing the fear that I knew was on all our minds. Remy's face was grim. "I don't know," he admitted. "The lore isn't clear on how the curse spreads. Some say any wound is enough, others that you have to be killed by one to turn. We'll have to wait and see." The implication was clear. If I started to turn, they might have to kill me. The thought should have terrified me, but I found myself nodding in agreement. After what I'd seen, the idea of becoming one of those monsters was worse than death. "So what's our next move?" I asked, trying to focus on the immediate problem. Remy moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "We're low on ammo, and that thing knows where we are. We need to move, find somewhere more defensible." "Move where?" Ethan asked. "We're miles from anywhere, and that thing is still out there." Remy was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful. "There's an old mine about 5 miles north of here," he said finally. "It's been abandoned for years, but the entrance is reinforced with steel. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, we gathered what supplies we could and prepared to venture out into the frozen wilderness once more. As we stepped out of the cabin, the wind howling around us and the vast expanse of snow-covered forest stretching out before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far worse than what we were leaving behind. The Wendigo was still out there, waiting, and now it had tasted our blood. Our desperate journey was far from over. In fact, I feared it was only just beginning. The forest in the early morning light was a study in contrasts, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The snow glittered like diamonds in the weak sunlight, and icicles hung from the branches like crystal daggers. But the beauty did little to mask the danger we were in. Every shadow could be hiding our pursuer. Every sound could be the Wendigo preparing to strike. We moved as quickly as we could through the deep snow, Remy leading the way with his compass and an old weathered map. Ethan and I followed, our eyes constantly scanning the trees around us. The pain in my chest was a constant reminder of how close we'd come to death in the cabin, and how precarious our situation still was. "How are you holding up?" Ethan asked quietly as we trudged through a particularly deep snowdrift. I tried to give him a reassuring smile, but I'm not sure I succeeded. "I'm alive," I said. "That's something, right?" Ethan nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He kept glancing at the bandages visible through my torn jacket, as if expecting to see some visible sign of the Wendigo's curse taking hold. We had been walking for maybe 2 hours when Remy suddenly held up a hand, signaling us to stop. He stood perfectly still, head cocked to one side as if listening for something. "What is it?" I whispered, straining my own ears but hearing nothing but the wind. Remy's face was grim. "We're being followed," he said softly. "It's stalking us." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. I looked around wildly, half expecting to see the Wendigo lunging at us from behind every tree, but the forest remained still and silent. "What do we do?" Ethan asked, his hand tightening on his rifle. Remy was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. "There's a ravine about a half-mile ahead," he said finally. "If we can make it there, we might be able to lose it, or at least slow it down." We picked up our pace, no longer trying to move quietly. Speed was more important than stealth now. As we half ran, half stumbled through the snow, I began to hear what Remy had detected earlier, a soft crunching sound just out of sync with our own footsteps. Something was indeed following us, matching our pace. The ravine came into view just as I thought my lungs would burst from the effort of running through the deep snow. It was a deep gash in the earth, its sides steep and treacherous. A half-frozen river ran along its bottom, the ice creaking and groaning in the cold. "Down there," Remy said, pointing to a narrow path that zigzagged down the ravine side. "Careful, it'll be slippery." We had just started our descent when we heard it, that awful, inhuman howl that we'd come to associate with the Wendigo. It was close, too close. "Move!" Remy shouted, all pretense of quiet abandoned. We scrambled down the path, slipping and sliding on the icy rocks. I chanced to glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The Wendigo was at the top of the ravine, its elongated form silhouetted against the sky. Even from this distance, I could see the malevolent glow of its eyes. Then it began to descend, moving with a speed and agility that defied belief. It didn't bother with the path, instead leaping from rock to rock with impossible grace. "It's coming!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. We abandoned any attempt at careful descent, half running, half falling down the steep incline. Rocks and ice tore at my hands as I scrabbled for purchase, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror driving me forward. We reached the bottom of the ravine just as the Wendigo landed behind us with a bone-jarring thud. Without hesitation, Remy opened fire, the sound of the gunshots echoing off the ravine walls. "The ice!" Ethan shouted, gesturing to the frozen river. "Maybe it won't follow us there." It was a desperate plan, but we had no other options. We sprinted onto the ice, our boots slipping and sliding with each step. Behind us, the Wendigo roared in frustration as Remy's bullets tore into its flesh. We were about halfway across the river when I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, a long, drawn-out crack that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The ice is breaking," I yelled, but it was too late. With a thunderous boom, the ice beneath our feet shattered. I had a moment of weightlessness, and then I was plunging into water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing me at once. The shock of it drove the air from my lungs. I flailed wildly, trying to find the surface, but the current was strong, pulling me under. In the murky water, I caught a glimpse of a dark shape moving with terrifying speed. The Wendigo, pursuing us even here. Just as my lungs were about to burst, my head broke the surface. I gasped for air, coughing and spluttering. The current was carrying me swiftly downstream, chunks of ice bumping against me as I struggled to stay afloat. "Ethan!" I called out, my voice weak. "Remy!" For a heart-stopping moment, there was no response. Then I heard Ethan's voice, faint over the rush of the water. "Marcus! Over here!" I turned to see Ethan clinging to a large chunk of ice a little ways downstream. With the last of my strength, I swam towards him, fighting against the current and the numbing cold. Ethan helped pull me onto the ice floe, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip my jacket. "Remy!" he managed to stutter through chattering teeth. "Can't see him." I looked around wildly, but there was no sign of our guide. The river bent sharply ahead, and the current was carrying us swiftly towards it. And somewhere in the icy water, the Wendigo was still hunting us. As we clung to our precarious raft, being swept towards who knew what, I realized that our situation had gone from desperate to nearly hopeless. We were soaked to the skin in sub-zero temperatures, separated from our only experienced guide, and still being pursued by a monster out of nightmare. The only question now was what would kill us first, the cold, the Wendigo, or whatever lay around the river's bend. As the ice floe carried us around the bend, the roar of the river suddenly increased tenfold. With growing horror, I realized what we were hearing. "Waterfall!" Ethan yelled, his eyes wide with fear. Sure enough, just ahead, the river simply disappeared, dropping away into a misty abyss. We were being swept directly towards it, our ice floe offering no means of steering or slowing our progress. "We have to jump!" I shouted, looking frantically for any alternative. The riverbanks were steep and icy, offering no easy escape. Ethan nodded grimly, understanding our desperate situation. As we neared the falls, we could see a small outcropping of rock jutting out from one side. It wasn't much, but it was our only chance. "On 3!" I yelled over the roar of the water. "1, 2, 3!" We leapt from the ice floe just as it reached the edge of the falls. For a heart-stopping moment, we were airborne, the mist from the waterfall soaking us even further. Then we hit the outcropping hard, the impact driving what little air remained from our lungs. Gasping and coughing, we clung to the slippery rock, our frozen fingers struggling to find purchase. Slowly, painfully, we dragged ourselves away from the edge of the falls and onto slightly more stable ground. For a long moment, we just lay there, trembling with cold and exhaustion. We were alive, but our situation was still dire. We were soaked to the bone in sub-zero temperatures, separated from Remy and most of our supplies, and still being hunted by the Wendigo. We need to move," Ethan stuttered through chattering teeth. "Find shelter before we freeze." I nodded, knowing he was right, but unsure if I had the strength to stand, let alone walk. Every movement was agony, my wet clothes already stiffening with ice. With supreme effort, we helped each other to our feet. Looking around, I saw that we were at the bottom of a steep gorge. The waterfall thundered behind us, and sheer rock walls rose on either side. Our only option was to follow the river downstream and hope it led us somewhere, anywhere, that might offer shelter. We had been walking, or rather stumbling, for maybe half an hour when Ethan suddenly stopped, pointing ahead with a shaking hand. "Look," he managed to say through chattering teeth. I followed his gaze, squinting through the gathering darkness. At first I saw nothing but more snow and rocks. Then I spotted it, a dark opening in the base of the cliff face. A cave. Hope surged through me, giving me a burst of energy. "Come on," I said, grabbing Ethan's arm to help support him. "We need to get out of this wind." We staggered towards the cave entrance, our frozen limbs protesting every step. As we drew closer, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The opening was oddly regular, almost perfectly arched. This was no natural formation. I think this might be part of the old mine Remy mentioned," I said as we reached the entrance. Ethan nodded weakly. "Better than freezing out here," he mumbled. We stumbled into the cave, relieved to be out of the biting wind. The interior was pitch black, the fading daylight from outside barely penetrating a few feet in. I fumbled in my pocket, praying that my waterproof matches had lived up to their name. To my immense relief, the matches lit. The small flame revealed a tunnel stretching back into the mountain, old mining equipment scattered about. Wooden support beams, some worryingly rotted, lined the walls and ceiling. "We need to get warm and dry," I said, looking around for anything we could use. "Help me gather some of this wood. Hopefully some of it's dry enough to burn." We set about breaking up some of the old equipment. Crates, broken tool handles, anything that looked like it might catch fire. It was slow work with our numbed hands, but the activity at least got our blood flowing a bit. Finally, we had a small pile of wood. I set about trying to start a fire, while Ethan explored a bit further into the tunnel. "Marcus," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "You need to see this." I looked up from my struggling fire-starting attempts to see Ethan standing next to an old mining cart. But it wasn't the cart that had caught his attention. Carved into the wall beside it was a symbol, a crude stick figure with elongated limbs and an oddly shaped head. "Is that—" I started, not wanting to finish the thought. Ethan nodded grimly. Looks like a Wendigo to me. I think the miners might have known about these things. The implications of that were chilling. How long had these creatures been haunting these mountains? And if the miners knew about them, why hadn't we ever heard these stories before? A spark caught in our pile of wood, distracting me from these unsettling thoughts. Soon we had a small but warm fire going. We stripped off our frozen outer layers, laying them out to dry as best we could. As we huddled close to the fire, I couldn't help but think of Remy. Had he survived the river? Was he out there looking for us? Or had the Wendigo? I shook my head, trying to dispel the grim thoughts. "We need a plan," I said to Ethan. "We can't stay here forever." Ethan nodded, his face looking gaunt in the flickering firelight. "The mine," he said. "Remy said it might be defensible. Maybe there's another entrance we can find. Get our bearings." It was as good a plan as any. We decided to rest for a few hours, let our clothes dry out as much as possible, then explore deeper into the mine. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, Ethan was shaking me awake. "Marcus," he hissed. "Listen." I sat up, instantly alert. At first I heard nothing but the crackling of our dying fire. Then I caught it, a faint sound echoing from deep within the mine. It sounded almost like singing. "What the hell?" I whispered. Ethan's face was pale in the dim light. "It's been going on for a few minutes now. Sometimes it sounds like singing, sometimes like crying. But it's definitely coming from deeper in the mine." I stood up, wincing as my stiff muscles protested. "We need to check it out," I said, though every instinct was screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. We gathered what meager supplies we had left and fashioned crude torches from some of the drier pieces of wood. Then, with a shared look of determination and fear, we set off deeper into the mine. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching off in places. We chose to follow the main shaft, reasoning that it was our best chance of finding another exit. All the while that eerie sound continued, sometimes seeming to come from right around the next bend, other times fading to near inaudibility. We had been walking for maybe an hour when the tunnel suddenly opened up into a large cavern. Our torches couldn't penetrate the darkness fully, but I could see the glint of old machinery and what looked like a deep pit in the center of the room. The singing was louder here, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was beautiful in a haunting way, but there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Is someone there?" The singing cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then from the darkness beyond our torchlight came a voice. "Help me," it said, sounding for all the world like a frightened child. "Please, I'm lost. I'm so cold." Ethan took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I hissed. "Remember what Remy said about the Wendigo mimicking voices?" Ethan hesitated, conflict clear on his face. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, I can see your light. I'm scared." I felt a tug of sympathy, warring with my fear and suspicion. What if it really was a lost child? Could we live with ourselves if we abandoned them? But before we could decide what to do, a new sound cut through the cavern, the unmistakable roar of the Wendigo. It was close, too close. "Run!" I yelled, all thoughts of stealth abandoned. We sprinted across the cavern, our torches casting wild shadows. I could hear something large moving behind us, its claws scraping on the rock. We reached a narrow opening on the far side of the cavern and squeezed through, finding ourselves in another tunnel. This one sloped upwards, and I clung to the desperate hope that it might lead us to the surface. The sounds of pursuit faded as we ran, the tunnel twisting and turning. Just as I thought my lungs would burst from the effort, I saw a glimmer of light ahead. "There," I gasped. "I think that's the way out." We redoubled our efforts, practically falling over each other in our haste to reach the exit. As we drew closer, I could see that it was indeed an opening to the outside world. But something was wrong. The light coming through was too red, too flickering. We burst out of the tunnel and skidded to a halt, staring in horror at the scene before us. We were on a ledge high up the mountainside, looking out over the forest. But the forest was on fire. Huge swaths of trees were engulfed in flames, the fire spreading rapidly in the dry, cold air. "What the hell happened?" Ethan breathed, his eyes wide with shock. Before I could respond, a familiar voice came from behind us. "I'm sorry," it said. "I had no choice." We spun around to see Remy standing there, his clothes tattered and bloody, a flare gun in his hand. "Remy!" I exclaimed, relief warring with confusion. "You're alive! But did you start this fire?" Remy's face was grim, his eyes haunted. "It was the only way," he said. "The Wendigo. It's not just one creature. There's a whole pack of them in these mountains. This fire might be our only chance to drive them out, maybe even destroy them." As the implications of his words sank in, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. We were trapped on a mountainside, caught between a raging forest fire and a pack of mythical monsters. Our ordeal, it seemed, was far from over. In fact, it might have only just begun. The heat from the forest fire below was intense, a stark contrast to the biting cold air around us. Smoke billowed up the mountainside, making it hard to breathe. We stood there, frozen in shock and indecision, as Remy's words sank in. "A whole pack of them?" Ethan finally managed to say, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. Remy nodded grimly. "I've been tracking them for years," he said. "Thought I knew everything there was to know about Wendigos. But this is something else entirely. They're organized, working together in a way I've never seen before." I shook my head, trying to process this new information. "But the fire, you're going to destroy the whole forest." "Better the forest than the entire region," Remy shot back. "You don't understand what we're up against. These creatures, they're spreading. Every person they kill becomes one of them. If we don't stop them here, now, there's no telling how far they could reach." A horrible thought struck me. "The town," I said. "Whispering Pines, are they in danger?" Remy's face darkened. "They've always been in danger. Why do you think the population's been dwindling for years? People don't just leave Whispering Pines. They disappear." The implications of that were too horrible to contemplate. How many people had fallen victim to these creatures over the years? How had no one noticed? But there was no time to dwell on it. The fire was spreading rapidly, and the smoke was getting thicker. We needed to move. "We can't stay here," I said, coughing as a particularly thick plume of smoke engulfed us. "We need to find a way down the mountain." Remy nodded. "There's an old logging road not far from here. If we can reach it, we might be able to make it back to town." We set off along the narrow ledge, the heat of the fire at our backs driving us forward. The going was treacherous, the rock face slippery with ice in some places and crumbling away entirely in others. More than once, one of us nearly lost our footing, saved only by the quick reflexes of the others. We had been moving for maybe half an hour when we heard it. That now familiar howl, but multiplied. It wasn't just one voice, but many, a chorus of hunger and rage that echoed off the mountainside. "They're coming," Remy said, his face grim. "The fire's driving them out." As if in response to his words, dark shapes began to emerge from the smoke below us. They moved with unnatural speed and grace, leaping from rock to rock as they ascended the mountainside. "Run!" Remy yelled, already breaking into a sprint along the narrow ledge. We ran, our lungs burning from the smoke and exertion. I could hear the creatures gaining on us, their howls getting closer by the second. The ledge we were on started to widen. turning into a proper trail that switchbacked up the mountainside. Just as I thought we couldn't run any further, Remy skidded to a halt. "There!" he shouted, pointing to a gap in the rock face. "The old mine shaft. We can use it to cut through the mountain." We dove into the opening just as the first of the Wendigos reached our position. I caught a glimpse of glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws before Remy slammed a rusted metal door shut, dropping a heavy bar into place to secure it. "That won't hold them for long," he panted. "We need to keep moving." The mine shaft was pitch black, the only light coming from Remy's small flashlight. We moved as quickly as we dared, the uneven floor and low ceiling making progress difficult. Behind us we could hear the Wendigos clawing at the door, the metal groaning under their assault. We had been moving through the darkness for what felt like hours when Ethan suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears, at first hearing nothing but our own labored breathing and the distant sounds of pursuit. Then I caught it, a faint rumbling, seeming to come from all around us. Remy's face went pale in the dim light of the flashlight. "The fire," he said. "It must have weakened the mountain structure. This whole place could come down on our heads." As if to prove his point, a shower of dust and small rocks fell from the ceiling. The rumbling was getting louder, and I could feel vibrations through the soles of my boots. "We need to get out of here," I said, stating the obvious. We started running again, no longer caring about stealth. The tunnel began to slope upwards, and I clung to the hope that we were nearing an exit. The rumbling had become a roar, and larger rocks were now falling around us. Just when I thought we were going to be buried alive, I saw a glimmer of light ahead. "There!" I shouted. "I think that's the way out." We put on a final burst of speed, practically climbing over each other in our desperation to reach the exit. We burst out into the open air just as a deafening crack split the air. Looking back, we saw the tunnel entrance collapse in on itself in a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, we just stood there, gasping for breath and hardly daring to believe we had made it. Then Remy grabbed our arms, pulling us away from the unstable ground near the collapsed tunnel. "We're not safe yet," he said grimly. "The Wendigos might have been buried in that cave-in, but I wouldn't count on it. And the fire is still spreading. We need to get back to town, warn everyone." As we started to move again, I couldn't help but wonder what we would find when we reached Whispering Pines. How much did the townspeople know about the horrors lurking in their forest? And even if we managed to warn them, where could they go? The fire was cutting off escape routes, and who knew how many Wendigos were still out there, waiting in the shadows. Our journey was far from over, and I had a sinking feeling that the true test of our survival was yet to come. The forest was burning, ancient horrors were on the loose, and we were caught in the middle of it all, running on exhaustion and desperation. As we made our way down the mountain, the sky above us glowed an ominous red, a testament to the inferno we had unleashed. Whatever happened next, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The world as we knew it was burning away, and what would rise from the ashes was anyone's guess. The journey back to Whispering Pines was a nightmare of smoke, ash, and constant vigilance. The fire had spread faster than we could have imagined, turning the once peaceful forest into an inferno. We moved as quickly as we could, always alert for the sound of pursuit or the crash of falling trees. Remy led the way, his experience in these woods proving invaluable. He guided us along game trails and old logging roads, always keeping us just ahead of the fire's advance. But even his knowledge had its limits. "This isn't right," he muttered, as we paused to catch our breath in a small clearing. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. The fire. It's not behaving naturally. It's almost like it's alive, trying to cut us off. I exchanged a worried glance with Ethan. After everything we'd seen, the idea of a sentient fire didn't seem as far-fetched as it should have. "Could it be the Wendigos?" Ethan asked. "Some kind of..." I don't know, psychic control over the fire? Remy shook his head. I've never heard of anything like that. But then again, I've never encountered a pack this large before. Who knows what they're capable of? A sharp crack from nearby sent us all diving for cover. A massive pine tree, its trunk weakened by the fire, came crashing down mere feet from where we had been standing. The impact shook the ground, sending up a cloud of ash and embers. We need to keep moving, Remy said, coughing as he struggled to his feet. We're still too exposed out here. We pressed on, the heat of the fire at our backs driving us forward. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe and nearly impossible to see. More than once we stumbled over hidden roots or rocks, each fall a reminder of how precarious our situation was. It was Ethan who first spotted the lights through the haze. Look, he called out, pointing ahead. I think that's the town. Sure enough, as we drew closer, the vague shapes of buildings began to emerge from the smoke. But something was wrong. The town was too quiet, too still. There should have been chaos. People evacuating, emergency vehicles, something. Instead, there was nothing but eerie silence. As we entered the outskirts of Whispering Pines, the wrongness of the scene became even more apparent. Cars sat abandoned in the streets, some with doors left open as if their occupants had fled in a hurry. Windows were broken, and here and there we saw signs of a struggle, overturned trash cans, scattered personal belongings. Where is everyone? I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the deserted street. Remy's face was grim. I have a bad feeling about this, he said. We need to check the emergency shelter. If anyone's left in town, that's where they'll be. We made our way through the empty streets, our footsteps echoing off the buildings. The emergency shelter was located in the basement of the town hall, a sturdy stone building at the center of Whispering Pines. As we approached, I felt a glimmer of hope. The building appeared intact, and I could see lights on inside. Remy held up a hand, signaling us to stop. Something's not right, he whispered. Look at the door. I peered through the smoke and saw what had caught his attention. The heavy metal door of the shelter was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges as if it had been torn open from the inside. Oh, God, Ethan breathed. Do you think... Remy nodded grimly. We need to be ready for anything. Stay close, and if I say run, you run. No questions, no hesitation. Slowly, cautiously, we approached the open door. The interior was dark, the emergency lights casting long shadows. As we entered, the smell hit us, a sickly sweet odor of decay that made my stomach churn. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. Is anyone here? For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from the darkness at the back of the shelter, came a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by the scrape of claws on concrete. Out! Remy yelled. Now! We turned to run, but it was too late. Dark shapes emerged from the shadows, moving with terrifying speed. Red eyes gleamed in the dim light, and I caught flashes of razor-sharp teeth and elongated limbs. The Wendigos had beaten us to Whispering Pines. What followed was a nightmare of confusion and terror. We fought and ran, our world narrowing to a desperate struggle for survival. I remember flashes of the battle, Remy's gun booming in the confined space, Ethan swinging a broken pipe like a club, my own hands bloody from clawing at monstrous forms. Somehow we made it back outside, but our situation was hardly improved. More Wendigos were emerging from the buildings around us, drawn by the sounds of combat. The entire town seemed to be overrun. The fire! Ethan shouted. It's our only chance! Understanding dawned on Remy's face. Of course, he said. They're creatures of ice and darkness. The fire might be able to destroy them. It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. We ran through the streets, the pack of Wendigos hot on our heels. The fire had reached the edge of town now, and we could feel its heat at our backs. Just when I thought we couldn't run any further, Remy spotted an old tanker truck parked near the gas station. "There!" he yelled. "If we can ignite that, it might be enough to take out the whole pack." We sprinted for the truck, the howls of the Wendigos echoing all around us. Remy reached it first, quickly working to open the valve on the tanker. The smell of gasoline filled the air. "Get ready to run," he said, pulling out his flare gun. The Wendigos were closing in, a mass of twisted limbs and glowing eyes. Remy waited until the last possible moment, then fired the flare directly into the spreading pool of gasoline. The world exploded into light and heat. The force of the blast threw us off our feet, and for a moment all I could hear was a high-pitched ringing. As my vision cleared, I saw the Wendigos shrieking and thrashing as the flames engulfed them. We staggered to our feet, supporting each other as we limped away from the inferno. Behind us, Whispering Pines burned, taking its dark secrets with it. As we reached the edge of town, I turned for one last look. The fire had spread to most of the buildings now, and in its light, I could see dark shapes fleeing into the forest, the surviving Wendigos, driven out by the flames. "It's over," Ethan said, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. But Remy shook his head. "No," he said grimly. "This is just the beginning. We've driven them back, but they're still out there. And now they'll be desperate, hungry." I realized he was right. We had won a battle, but the war was far from over. As the sun began to rise, casting an eerie light through the smoke-filled sky, I knew that our lives had changed forever. We were no longer just Marcus, Ethan, and Remy. We were survivors, witnesses to horrors beyond imagination. And now, we were the only ones who could stand against the darkness that lurked in the frozen north. As we turned and began the long walk towards the nearest town, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden in the vast wilderness around us. What other ancient horrors might be awakening, drawn by the scent of fear and the taste of human flesh. One thing was certain: our adventure was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning. The days following the destruction of Whispering Pines passed in a blur of exhaustion, debriefings, and disbelief. The outside world struggled to make sense of what had happened. Official reports blamed a freak wildfire, exacerbated by dry conditions and high winds. The disappearance of the town's population was attributed to a mass evacuation gone wrong. But we knew the truth. Remy, Ethan, and I were kept in a makeshift quarantine at a military base, ostensibly for smoke inhalation and exposure. But I could tell from the way the doctors looked at us, the whispered conversations that stopped when we entered a room, that they suspected there was more to our story. It was on the 5th day of our confinement that we received an unexpected visitor. A woman in a crisp suit, flanked by 2 stone-faced men who were clearly security of some kind, entered our shared room. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice clipped and professional, "my name is Dr. Elena Volkov. I represent a specialized division of the government. We need to talk about what really happened in Whispering Pines." For a moment, we all just stared at her. Then Remy let out a bitter laugh. "Took you long enough," he said. "I was wondering when you people would show up." Dr. Volkov raised an eyebrow. "You've encountered our organization before, Mr. Beauchamp?" Remy's face darkened. "Let's just say this isn't my first rodeo with things that go bump in the night. Your lot always show up to clean up the mess and bury the truth." "On the contrary," Dr. Volkov said, taking a seat, "we're here to understand the truth, the full truth, and to offer you a choice." Over the next few hours, Dr. Volkov laid out a story that seemed impossible, and yet, after what we'd been through, all too believable. There was a hidden world of supernatural threats, not just Wendigos, but a whole menagerie of creatures that defied scientific explanation. Vampires, werewolves, spirits, and things that had no name in any human language. Her organization, which she referred to only as the Agency, was tasked with monitoring these threats and, when necessary, intervening to protect humanity. They operated in the shadows, keeping the general public ignorant of the true nature of the world around them. "Which brings us to you three," she said, her gaze intense. "You've seen things that most people couldn't comprehend. You fought creatures that shouldn't exist. And you've survived. That makes you valuable." "Valuable how?" Ethan asked, speaking for the first time since Dr. Volkov had entered. "We want to recruit you," she said simply. "Train you. Make you part of our frontline defense against these threats." I felt a mix of emotions at her words: fear, excitement, disbelief. Part of me wanted nothing more than to go home, to try and forget everything that had happened. But another part, a part that had awakened in the frozen forests of the north, knew that I could never go back to my old life. "What if we say no?" I asked. Dr. Volkov's face remained impassive. "Then you'll be free to go. We'll provide you with a cover story, compensation for your troubles. But you'll be on your own, and I can assure you, once you've glimpsed this world, it has a way of finding you again, whether you're prepared or not." I looked at Ethan and Remy. I could see the same conflict I felt mirrored in their eyes. We had been through hell together, seen things that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The idea of facing that alone was terrifying. Remy was the first to speak. "I'm in," he said gruffly. "Been doing this solo for too long anyway. Might be nice to have some backup." Ethan nodded slowly. "I can't go back to my old life," he said, "not knowing what I know now. At least this way, maybe I can make a difference." They both looked at me. I took a deep breath, thinking of the quiet life I had planned for myself, the normal job, the peaceful existence. All of that seemed like a distant dream now. "Okay," I said finally. "I'm in too. But I have conditions. I want to know everything. No more secrets, no more half-truths. And I want to be involved in protecting my home. The North isn't just a wasteland to be written off. It's my home, and I'll defend it." Dr. Volkov nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I think we can work with that," she said. "Welcome to the agency, gentlemen. Your training begins tomorrow." As she stood to leave, I felt a mix of trepidation and resolve. We were about to step into a world of shadows and monsters, a world where the line between myth and reality blurred. But we would face it together, armed with the knowledge and skills to make a difference. The frozen North had changed us, forged us in fire and ice. Now it was time to take that strength and use it to protect others from the horrors we had faced. As Dr. Volkov reached the door, she paused and turned back to us. "Oh, and one more thing," she said. "You might want to familiarize yourselves with these." She tossed a thick file onto the table. The label read, "Operation Fenrir, Wendigo Incursion Protocols." I reached for the file, my hand trembling slightly. As I opened it, I knew that our adventure in Whispering Pines had been just the beginning. A new chapter of our lives was about to start, one filled with danger, mystery, and the unknown. The echoes of our experience in the frozen North would guide us as we stepped into this new world. And whatever came next, we would face it together, guardians against the darkness that lurked at the edges of our world. The agency's training facility was unlike anything I could have imagined. Located deep in the Rocky Mountains, it was a sprawling complex of modern buildings and state-of-the-art training grounds, all hidden from the outside world by advanced camouflage technology and misdirection tactics. Our days were filled with intense physical training, weapons practice, and classes on everything from cryptozoology to ancient languages. We learned about the various supernatural threats that existed in the world, each more terrifying than the last. Wendigos, it turned out, were just the tip of the iceberg. Remy, with his years of experience, quickly became a favorite among the instructors. His practical knowledge of hunting supernatural creatures was invaluable, and he often assisted in teaching fieldcraft and survival skills. Ethan threw himself into the academic side of our training, his scientific background allowing him to approach the supernatural from a unique perspective. He was particularly interested in the biological aspects of various creatures, always seeking to understand the science behind the seemingly impossible. As for me, I found myself drawn to the tactical and strategic aspects of our training. My experiences in Whispering Pines had awakened a talent for quick thinking and adaptability in crisis situations. I also focused heavily on learning about the various supernatural threats specific to the northern regions, determined to make good on my promise to protect my home. It was during one of these northern-focused training sessions, about 3 months into our time at the facility, that we received news that would change everything. Dr. Volkov entered the classroom, her usually composed face showing signs of worry. "We have a situation," she said without preamble. "There's been another Wendigo sighting, this time near a small town called Frost Haven, about 100 miles north of where Whispering Pines used to be." I felt my blood run cold. Frost Haven was less than 50 miles from my hometown. "We thought we'd driven them back," Ethan said, voicing what we were all thinking. Dr. Volkov shook her head. "It seems the pack was larger than we initially believed, or perhaps they're spreading faster than we anticipated. Either way, we need to act quickly." She turned to face us directly. "I know you're not finished with your training, but you three have more practical experience with Wendigos than anyone else in the agency. We need you on this mission." Remy stood up, his face set with determination. "When do we leave?" "Immediately," Dr. Volkov replied. "You'll be briefed on the way. This is a covert operation. Get in, assess the situation, and neutralize the threat if possible. If not, call for backup. Under no circumstances are you to allow knowledge of the supernatural to spread to the general population. Understood?" We nodded, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't a training exercise. This was real, and people's lives were at stake. As we hurried to gather our gear, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. We were heading back into danger, back to face the creatures that had nearly killed us. But this time we were prepared. We had knowledge, training, and the backing of a secret organization dedicated to fighting these threats. The journey to Frost Haven was tense, filled with last-minute briefings and equipment checks. As our transport, a specially modified helicopter designed for stealth operations, approached the drop zone, I looked out at the vast expanse of snow-covered forest below. Somewhere out there, ancient horrors were stirring. Creatures of hunger and cold were threatening innocent people who had no idea of the danger they were in. It was up to us to stop them. As we touched down in a clearing just outside Frost Haven, I shared a look with Ethan and Remy. No words were needed. We all knew what was at stake, and we were ready to face whatever came next. The hunt was on once again, but this time, we were the predators. Frost Haven was a town that seemed frozen in time, its streets lined with quaint wooden buildings that could have been there for a century. But beneath the picturesque exterior, we could sense an undercurrent of fear. The streets were eerily quiet, and the few residents we saw hurried about their business with wary glances over their shoulders. We set up our base of operations in an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town. As night fell, we prepared for our first reconnaissance mission. "Remember," Remy said as we checked our gear, "we're here to gather information first. No engaging unless absolutely necessary." Ethan and I nodded, the weight of our responsibility heavy on our shoulders. As we moved through the silent streets, our training kicked in. We were alert for any sign of Wendigo activity, unusual tracks, unexplained noises, or the telltale chill that seemed to accompany their presence. It was Ethan who spotted the first clue. "Look," he whispered, pointing to a series of deep gouges in the side of a building. "Claw marks, too big for any normal animal. We followed the trail, our hearts pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. It led us to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to the vast, dark forest. "They're using the woods as cover," Remy muttered. "Smart. They could be anywhere out there." Just then, a blood-curdling scream split the night. Without hesitation, we sprinted towards the sound, our training overriding our fear. We burst into a small clearing to find a terrifying scene. A Wendigo, even larger and more monstrous than the ones we'd encountered before, was looming over a fallen figure. But before we could act, something unexpected happened. The fallen person, a woman we could now see, raised her hand. A burst of blue-white light erupted from her palm, striking the Wendigo and sending it reeling backward. "What the hell?" Ethan gasped. The woman scrambled to her feet, her hands glowing with that same eerie light. She turned to face us, her eyes widening in surprise. "You're not from Frosthaven," she said. It wasn't a question. "We're here to help," I said, keeping my voice calm despite my shock. "We're with an organization that deals with supernatural threats." She laughed, a bitter sound. "You're a bit late. Frosthaven has been dealing with supernatural threats for generations." Over the next hour, we learned the truth about Frosthaven. The town had been founded by a group of magic practitioners centuries ago, seeking a remote place to practice their arts in peace. Over time, they had become the secret protectors of the region, using their powers to keep creatures like the Wendigos at bay. "But something's changed," the woman who introduced herself as Sarah explained. "The Wendigos are getting stronger, more numerous. Our magic isn't enough anymore." We shared what we knew about the Wendigo pack, and Sarah's face grew grave. "If they've grown to such numbers, nowhere in the north will be safe," she said. "We need to end this, once and for all." Sarah led us to a hidden chamber beneath the town hall, where the town's elders were gathered. They listened to our story and shared their own knowledge. Together, we formulated a plan. The elders knew of an ancient ritual that could banish the Wendigos, not just from Frosthaven, but from our entire plane of existence. But it would require a tremendous amount of power, more than any one person could provide. "I'll do it," Remy said, his voice firm. "I've been fighting these things longer than anyone. It should be me." Despite our protests, Remy was adamant. As dawn broke, we made our preparations. The plan was to lure the Wendigo pack to a sacred site deep in the forest where the elders would perform the ritual. The battle that followed was like something out of a nightmare. Wendigos seemed to come from every direction, their howls filling the air. Ethan and I fought side by side with the people of Frosthaven, our weapons and their magic creating a formidable defense. At the center of it all stood Remy and the elders, their voices raised in an otherworldly chant. As the ritual reached its climax, a blinding light engulfed Remy. The Wendigos shrieked in what sounded like fear, their forms beginning to waver and distort. "Remy!" I yelled, trying to reach him, but the light was too intense. There was a final deafening roar, and then silence. As our vision cleared, we saw that the Wendigos were gone, but so was Remy. Where he had stood was nothing but scorched earth. Of our friend and mentor there was no sign. Sarah approached us, her face solemn. "The ritual worked," she said softly. "The Wendigos are gone. But the price, the person who channels the power becomes the anchor for the banishment. Your friend, he's gone beyond our reach." Ethan and I stood in shocked silence, the victory we'd achieved feeling hollow in the face of our loss. Remy had sacrificed himself to save not just Frosthaven, but potentially the entire world from the Wendigo threat. As the people of Frosthaven began the process of rebuilding, Ethan and I knew that our work was far from over. There were other threats out there, other monsters to face, and we would face them, carrying Remy's memory and his final lesson with us. Sometimes, to protect what we love, we have to be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. Remy had understood that, and in the end he had become more than just a hunter. He had become a true hero. As we prepared to leave Frost Haven, I looked out at the vast, snow-covered landscape. Somewhere out there in a realm beyond our understanding, Remy was standing guard, ensuring that the Wendigos would never threaten our world again. The frozen north had taken much from us, but it had also given us purpose. And as long as there were threats to face and people to protect, we would continue the work that Remy had started. Back in July of '75, I'd only been a park ranger for a few months at the Yosemite backcountry. Honestly, I still thought of myself more as a glorified camper than an actual ranger. Getting to explore the park and call it work was a dream gig after all. Still, the job was no less important because I was new, which is exactly what I was explaining to a new group of backpackers who had come to my post to get their permits squared away. "Don't worry, we're careful with fires," the ringleader, a portly old fellow with a bushy mustache, reassured me. They all looked the experienced type, so I tried to keep the spiel short and sweet. "I know you are. Just remember to double-check them before you leave. Fire's no joke." I gave them a friendly reminder. Of course, the bushy mustache guy nodded, looking mildly offended at my implication. I wrapped up with the routine warnings about trash and bear canisters, trying to lighten the mood with a joke about raccoons being even wilder than bears sometimes. They chuckled politely, a couple of the women a little more genuinely than the fellas, then headed off for their trailhead. The group was probably headed to May Lake or somewhere deeper in. Since all the paperwork was in order, I turned back to other duties, mostly tidying up around my station and updating the logbook. The job was full of these quiet moments. There was always work to do, but thankfully nothing too pressing. It was one of the nicer parts of the job, the downtime. The rest of the day passed without incident. A few stragglers stopped to ask directions, 2 separate couples asked about wildlife sightings, and of course someone wanted to complain about the park's mosquito population. That afternoon, I finished up around sunset and headed back to the tiny ranger's cabin I called home. It was tucked away in a small copse of trees, offering some decent privacy in the otherwise bustling heart of the park. By the time I arrived, night had fallen, casting the whole forest in inky black. The ranger's cabin was just a faint silhouette in the darkness. I was just fishing out my flashlight when a sound snagged my attention. It came from the woods behind the cabin, the rhythmic crack of a branch, followed by a low rustling. I held my breath. It was normal enough to hear small animals out here, squirrels or maybe even a deer. Maybe I'd spooked something bigger on my walk back. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding a bit thin even to my own ears. Nothing, just silence. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my newbie nerves, and went inside. After cooking up a simple dinner, I sat out on the porch for a while. The sky was a canvas of stars, the summer air heavy with the scent of pine. The next morning, I woke up early, energized to do a patrol of the back trails. I'd been meaning to do the loop out west in 2 alumni meadows for a while. I grabbed a granola bar, packed a lunch, and radioed headquarters about my route. Out there, it was mandatory to check in so they knew where to find you if something went wrong. The first few miles of the trail were uneventful, thankfully. It was a gorgeous day, perfect for hiking. The route was fairly popular, so I crossed paths with a few groups, always stopping for a quick chat and a reminder about the usual fire hazards. It wasn't unusual to encounter the same people at various points along the loop. The park was vast, but so were some hikers' itineraries. I found a nice little rock to sit and enjoy my lunch. It was starting to get pretty hot out, and a touch of shade was a welcome respite. While I was unwrapping my sandwich, I thought I heard a rustling over by the creek, but when I looked, nothing. Just the wind through the trees, probably. Nervy again, damn it. I needed to shake off this rookie anxiety. I ate in peace, tossing the last bits of my crust to a squirrel who was eyeing me with bold curiosity. Getting back on the trail, it was smooth sailing for a good hour, meandering through a thick patch of pines, and then the trail just disappeared. Confused, I backtracked a few paces, looking for signs I might have missed a fork or a detour. Finding nothing, I cursed my inattentiveness. It wasn't the first time this had happened out on patrol. Hikers often made their own makeshift trails that went nowhere. But this one had been so well trodden. Shrugging, I backtracked again, planning to find another path that connected further down the mountain, even if it meant a slightly longer loop. I was walking for a good 20 minutes before I realized something was truly wrong. The forest was growing denser, the trees unfamiliar as they closed in around me. The sun, already lower on the horizon, was barely filtering through the canopy. Yet there was no marked trail, no indication I was heading in the right direction. I was completely lost. Panic started to rise in my chest, that prickly, cold, sweat kind of panic I'd only felt a few times in my life. Losing your bearings in the wilderness was serious business, and even with my radio, if the rangers started a search party, these woods were thick enough to make it a long haul. I paused, trying to think logically, which involved trying to calm myself down. I fished out my compass, then cursed aloud as it spun wildly, the magnetic field thrown off by something nearby. No help there. The experienced hiker in me knew you shouldn't wander aimlessly when lost. Better to pick a spot and stay put, conserve your energy, and hope to be found. But something about this felt off. The whole situation was unsettling. This sudden, impossible detour on a clear enough trail. Against my better judgment, I decided to push on, keeping the sun to my right as I continued west. My pace was brisk now, a mix of desperation and the sinking certainty that something wasn't adding up. Then I saw it, a movement just at the edge of my vision. I whipped my head around, heart racing. There was nothing to see, yet this sense that I was being watched was overwhelming. Then I caught it again, a dark shape, moving fast, darting from tree to tree. But whenever I turned to get a good look at it, it was gone. It was too big to be any animal I knew of, and this unnatural speed. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound brave, but my voice came out a croak. I strained my eyes, searching the shadows between the trunks. Silence. Only the distant creak of branches and my own ragged breaths. The fear was starting to gnaw away at my focus, turning my movements jerky. Every rustle of leaves had me on edge. It was like a game of hide and seek, only I didn't know the rules or what it even was. I pushed on doggedly, trying to outrun my imagination, trying to get back to something familiar. The sun was sinking fast, casting long, strange shadows. My fear intensified with every step. And still, whatever was stalking me stayed in the periphery, unseen yet unnervingly present. A tree directly ahead of me shuddered violently, its leaves cascaded down like rain. For a split second I saw it, a colossal shape, hunched low against the trunk, the bark a mottled texture like old stretched skin. It turned its head and I couldn't make out a face, but I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it was looking straight at me. My mind went blank with terror. No scream, no movement. Time seemed to freeze as I stared at this thing that could not exist. It was massive, easily twice as tall as I was, its silhouette bulky and contorted. Its limbs were long, too long, ending in twiggy appendages that almost seemed like fingers, but so much longer and thicker. It moved with a chilling fluidity, its joints shifting and bending in ways that made my stomach churn. And then, it launched itself towards me, moving with a speed that defied belief. I barely had time to register its horrifying lunge before I turned and ran. Every instinct in my body screamed to get as far away from this creature as possible. Branches whipped past me, tearing at my skin, and my feet barely seemed to touch the forest floor. Still, I could hear it gaining, its heavy footfalls and rustling breaths growing closer. I was nearing the edge of a clearing, a break in the tree line that opened into a rocky cliff. My heart lurched with hope, even as my legs throbbed in protest. Just a little farther. My lungs felt like they were on fire, each ragged breath burning my throat. That damn clearing was so close now, yet it seemed to stretch out endlessly like a mirage in a desert. I tripped over a root, falling hard, scraping up my palms. The heavy thud of its steps was right behind me. Rolling over, I stared up at the trees, the monster about to crash through the foliage and silence. Nothing but the echo of my own harsh breaths. I scrambled to my feet, half expecting it to drop from the canopy at any second to lunge out from behind a tree trunk. But still, nothing. I turned this way and that, trying to spot it amidst the shadows, the silence somehow more terrifying than its previous pursuit. Unable to think clearly, I stumbled towards the clearing, drawn to the open sky and the relative promise of safety it offered. My body was shaking, adrenaline threatening to turn into full-blown panic. Just as I was about to burst out of the trees, something seized my ankle in an unbreakable grip. I yelped in terror, falling back to the earth, its hand wrapped around my leg, long, gnarled fingers digging into my skin with a strength that made me scream in pain. I kicked out with my other leg, fighting frantically. It barely reacted. I was being dragged backward, back toward those monstrous eyes lurking in the darkness. Desperation made me thrash wildly, clawing at the iron grip around my ankle. It didn't move an inch, but I caught a glimpse of my attacker's arm, pale beneath the thick black fur. It moved as it dragged me back into the trees, sinuous and unnatural. Its skin was leathery, almost bark-like, mottled with lichen green patches. Scrabbling for purchase, my hand closed around a fallen branch. Without thinking, I swung it with all my remaining force at the creature's wrist. To my absolute surprise, I heard a crack and a hiss, and the grip immediately loosened. I kicked out again, this time managing to break free. My attacker howled in what was either pain or rage, a sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't look back as I bolted toward the clearing. Bursting into the open, the setting sun blazed in my eyes. I staggered toward the cliffside, the world tilting and spinning as exhaustion finally took its toll. When my vision cleared, I was standing at the precipice, the sharp drop-off and jagged rock stretching out below. I slumped down, panting heavily, too spent to even process the situation. It seemed I had reached a stalemate. Either it was too afraid of the fall or too injured to approach, but as the light faded, I knew I was trapped. I stayed huddled in a little ball, unable to force myself to do more than watch the sky shift through hues of dusk, and finally disappear into deep nightfall. It didn't attack, but I could sense it still out there, hidden in the darkness, a silent, menacing presence. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the day's terrifying ordeal. Hours later, when dawn broke, I was delirious with exhaustion and fear. I looked at the cliff edge and a desperate thought occurred to me. I might not survive a direct attack, but maybe, with a head start, I could risk the drop and scramble down before the creature caught up. I crept cautiously towards the edge. No sign of it, praying that the jagged rocks and fall wouldn't end me before the creature could. Time lost all meaning. I only remember scrambling, rolling, slipping downwards, a blur of cuts, bruises, and overwhelming terror. At some point I lost consciousness, waking up in a pile of leaves at the base of the cliff. I was battered, broken and bloodied, but alive. The sun was higher now, meaning precious time had been lost. I knew I needed to move. Somehow I pulled myself upright, ignoring the protests of my body. Every step was agony, and twice I nearly fainted, but I kept going. The adrenaline of survival wouldn't let me stop. Eventually, sheer willpower led me to a familiar hiking trail, where I collapsed completely. I woke up much later, not in the forest, but in a hospital bed. Rangers found me, apparently babbling incoherently. My injuries were extensive, but I recovered, physically at least. The Park Service, of course, had questions. At first, I couldn't speak about what happened. Later, when I tried, they chalked it up to shock and a nasty fall. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know it's still out there. The creature became a dark legend of the park, a campfire story told to scare new rangers and thrill adventurous hikers. The ones who believe my tale whisper its name, Branch Breaker. It haunts my nightmares, a reminder that the wilderness holds horrors stranger than we can imagine. My name is Bram Hawthorne, and I've been a park ranger at Calaveras Big Trees State Park in California for nearly a decade now. It's a job that most people imagine is all about serene nature walks and helping lost hikers find their way. And sure, a lot of days that's exactly what it is. But there's another side to these woods, a side that most folks never see. It's the side that could turn a man into one of those crazy wilderness hermits you hear about on true crime podcasts. I never thought I'd be telling this story. Hell, most days I try to convince myself it never happened. But the weight of it sits heavy on my chest, and I figure maybe by sharing it, I can lift some of that burden. Or maybe I'm just hoping that someone out there will tell me I'm not crazy, that what I saw was real. It all started on a day that seemed just like any other. July 15th, 2023. I remember the date because it was my younger sister's birthday, and I had promised to call her that evening. Funny how the mind clings to those normal details when everything else goes to hell. I arrived at the station just as the sun was peeking over the eastern ridge, painting the massive sequoias in shades of gold and amber. The air was crisp, carrying that sweet pine scent that never fails to center me. I went through my usual morning routine, coffee from the ancient percolator that's probably older than I am, a quick check of the weather report, clear skies, high of 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it was time to check in with base on the radio. Now, you wouldn't think that a simple radio check-in could be scary, would you? It's just routine. A way to make sure everything's running smoothly before heading out on patrol. But that morning, that simple act was the first step down a path I never could have imagined. I keyed the mic, the familiar static crackling through the speaker. Base, this is Ranger Hawthorne, checking in for morning patrol. Over. There was a pause, longer than usual. I was about to repeat the call when the radio crackled to life. But the voice that came through, it wasn't right. Bram. Copy. It was Old Man Gibson, our dispatcher. I don't even know his first name after all this time. Isn't that strange? But his voice, it was all wrong. Scratchy, like he was whispering, or like something was interfering with the signal. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. But you know how it is when you've done a job for so long. The routine of it all kind of dulls your senses. You start to explain away the oddities, file them under probably nothing because most of the time that's exactly what they are. Yep, Gibson, I copy, I replied, trying for a bit of lightheartedness. Maybe he was just having a rough morning. What you got for me today? Any lost Boy Scouts need rescuing? More static. Then Gibson's voice again, even fainter this time. Visitors, they... And then nothing. Just dead air. Gibson, you cutting out on me? Say again? I tried, that unease starting to crawl up my spine. Silence. Not even static. I tried a few more calls, but there was nothing. Just that oppressive silence that seemed to seep out of the radio and fill the whole station. Okay, I muttered to myself. Definitely weird. I tried to rationalize it. Calaveras isn't exactly known for its top-notch cell service, let alone radio towers. It was probably just a busted antenna or something. But I couldn't shake that feeling, you know? that gut instinct that something was off. Still, I had a job to do. I finished logging my route for the day and headed out to the old Jeep. It's a beat-up thing, older than some of the junior Rangers, but it's never let me down. As I climbed in, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Same old Bram shaggy brown hair in desperate need of a trim, 3-day stubble that I tell myself looks rugged but probably just looks unkempt, and eyes that have seen more of these woods than most. The Jeep rattled to life, and I set out on my patrol. The sun was already hot overhead, even though it was barely mid-morning. As I drove deeper into the park, something started to change. The trees, those massive sequoias that I've always seen as a kind of natural cathedral, they felt different, heavier somehow, more oppressive, like they were leaning in, watching. My gut instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to radio in that I was sick and head home. But there's that damn ranger responsibility, you know? What if someone really did need help out there? So I grit my teeth and pressed on, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. The first hour of patrol was quiet. Too quiet, really. No visitors, which wasn't too unusual for a weekday. But there was something else missing. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the call of birds overhead. It was all muted, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I saw a woodpecker hammering away at a dead log, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. A deer peeked out from the deep shadows between the trees, its eyes wide and wary. But that sense of being watched, man, it just kept getting stronger. I started talking to myself just to break the silence. "Come on, Bram," I muttered. "Get it together. What, you think Bigfoot's finally decided to make an appearance?" I chuckled, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. That's when it happened. I was rounding a bend in the trail, the Jeep's tires crunching over fallen pine needles, when I saw it. There, right across the trail, was a figure. I slammed on the brakes so hard I nearly pitched forward into the windshield. The Jeep's engine died, and in the sudden silence I could hear my own ragged breathing. The figure just stood there, dead still. It didn't even flinch at the screech of tires or the cloud of dust I'd kicked up. And you know, at first I didn't register how wrong it was. It was just a person in kind of strange, old-fashioned clothes. Nothing too alarming, right? But then I realized how tall it was. Way too tall. I'm not a short guy by any means. I stand at a solid 6'2" but this thing, it had to be pushing 7 feet easy, and lanky, with limbs that looked like they'd been stretched out on some medieval torture rack, and its head, God, its head. No face, I mean nothing. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth skin stretched tight across its skull. It was like looking at some freakish, oversized mannequin with way too many joints. The skin wasn't pale either, like you might expect from some horror movie monster. It was mottled brown in the dappled sunlight, almost like old tree bark. As I stared, unable to look away, I swear I saw patterns in that skin shift and change, like shadows of leaves in a breeze. Now this should have been the point where I threw the Jeep into reverse and got the hell out of there, right? That's what any sane person would have done. But this job, it kind of drills some stupid stubbornness into you, some misplaced sense of duty. I found myself thinking, maybe it's just some lost hiker who's not all there mentally. Maybe they need help. It was a leap, I know, but it was the only thing keeping me from total panic. So, with fingers that shook more than I'd like to admit, I grabbed the mic from the dash. "Gibson, come in." My voice sounded strange in the unnatural quiet. "I've got a visual on a possible lost or injured person. Over." Dead air. Not even static this time. That rational part of my brain, the voice yelling about lost hikers, it was starting to shrivel up real fast. What I did next, well, even I can't defend it in hindsight. I figured getting a closer look might, clear things up. Make sense of what I was seeing. I rolled down the window and suddenly the whole forest seemed too damn quiet. No birds, no insects, like everything alive just held its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Sir? Ma'am? Are you in need of assistance?" The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to acknowledge that I'd spoken, just stood there, unnervingly still. That's when the smell hit me. Rotting meat, that sickly sweet stench of decay, but mixed with something else, something that reminded me of sap gone sour. My stomach heaved, and that flight response finally surged up full blast. I fumbled with the Jeep's gears, ready to haul ass back the way I came, but I was too late. The thing moved, but not like anything I've ever seen move before. It didn't walk, not in any way that humans understand walking. It was more like its parts kind of disassembled and then reformed further down the trail, all without a sound. Think of one of those stop-motion videos where objects warp in and out of place. Jesus, just remembering it sends shivers down my spine. One moment the road ahead was clear, and the next, that thing, whatever the hell it was, had just manifested there out of nowhere. The road was blocked. I was trapped. Panic took over then. I threw the Jeep into park, the smell so strong now that I was gagging. I knew I had a pistol in the glove box standard issue for rangers in case of aggressive wildlife, but would it even work on something this unnatural? As I was fumbling for the gun, I heard a new sound. Clicking. Multiple clicks coming from all around, from up in the trees. I looked up and my blood ran cold. There were more of them. At least a dozen of those things, perched in the branches like grotesque, oversized birds. Their blank, featureless heads tilted in unison as they observed me, trapped in my Jeep like some bug in a jar. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the pistol out. It felt stupid, like bringing a pea shooter to a tank fight. But it was all I had, so I loaded a round and flicked off the safety. These things, they moved in that same freaky, non-human way, getting closer now. I could make out more details I wish I could scrub from my memory. Fingers like twigs, long and gnarled. Each step they took cracked dead branches underfoot, sending a ripple of sound echoing through the trees. That smell, it got stronger the closer they got. I tried to blank out my mind, focus only on aiming, on surviving this impossible situation. My first shot went wide, the pistol kicking hard in my hand. I swear one of those things tilted its head like it was amused by my pathetic attempt at defense. That's when I noticed the change in the air. The smell shifted. It wasn't just rotting meat anymore. There was a sharp metallic tang to it. Blood. And then I saw it. A flash of white moving through the trees. Not just a deer, though. Too large, too wrong. Its antlers weren't the smooth bone of any deer I'd ever seen. They were twisted, branching things that looked more like gnarled tree limbs than animal parts. It was charging, straight towards one of those things. Whatever this new creature was, it seemed to hate them as much as I did right now. I saw a chance, however slim. I started firing, not caring about aim anymore. Just noise, distraction. It worked. The attention of those branch-like figures shifted towards the charging creature, away from me. The monstrous deer, for lack of a better word, barreled into the clearing. Its hooves were like hammers slamming into dead wood. Its antlers snagged one of the things, lifting it clear off the ground. What followed? I'm not going to lie. It was pure, bloody chaos. A blur of thrashing limbs, piercing shrieks that sounded nothing like any animal I know. There was something beautiful, in a primal, terrifying way, about how that deer thing fought. It was nature's fury unleashed, raw and undiluted. While I fought with bullets, it fought with tooth and horn and pure, terrifying strength. For one heart-pounding moment, I thought it might actually win. But there were more of those things than I first thought. Tall forms emerged from the shadows surrounding the deer creature. It fought like 10 animals, twisting and kicking, each movement taking down one of its attackers. But for every one that fell, 2 more seemed to appear. I took my chance. I sprinted back to the Jeep, fumbling with the keys, the engine roaring to life. I slammed it into reverse and didn't stop. I drove blind, branches tearing at my clothes, the world blurring with tears and adrenaline. Somehow, I found the main trail. I didn't stop until I was back at the ranger station, the Jeep's engine smoking from the abuse. I stumbled in, babbling some crazy story about an animal attack, something about trespassers. I don't know how believable I was, but I think the sheer look in my eyes said enough. They called the cops, got a search party going, the whole deal. They never found anything, of course. No dead bodies, no trace of those things. But I found something. Days later, after I'd somewhat gathered my wits, I went back. I know, stupid, right? But I had to know. I had to see if there was any trace, any proof that I wasn't going insane. I found a clearing, torn to hell and back. Splinters of what looked like wood mixed with something else. Dark, sticky, smelling of iron and decay. And there in the churned-up earth was a single perfect antler, bone white, with twists and branches like nothing on God's green earth. In the quiet of my cabin, in those sleepless nights that followed, I thought a lot about names for the things I saw. Finally, one stuck. The dryads. Because of the way they moved, the tree-like skin. And because in old stories, dryads were protectors of the forest, weren't they? Maybe these things were something like that, twisted, corrupted, but fighting to protect their home, their way. Or maybe they were just monsters, driven by hunger or cruelty I can't fathom. The deer creature? Well, I like to think it's still out there. The Leshy, some old Slavic folklore calls it, guardian of the wild places. They never found a sign of Gibson, by the way. The radio tower worked perfectly fine once they checked it. As for me, I quit my job not long after. I can't handle the quiet of the woods anymore. But the Leshy and the dryads, I can't help but wonder. Was I the first to see them? Or are there others out there still fighting the unseen battles all around us? Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear them. Clicking, shuffling, watching. Always watching. And I wonder, what happens when they decide to leave the forest? The days following my encounter in the woods were a blur of questioning, doubt, and sleepless nights. The local authorities conducted a thorough search of the area where I claimed the incident occurred, but as I expected, they found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a struggle, no mysterious figures, no monstrous deer-like creature. Just the ancient silent sequoias standing watch as they had for centuries. I must have recounted my story a dozen times. To my superiors, to the police, to the search and rescue teams. With each retelling, I could see the doubt growing in their eyes. They were kind about it for the most part. Trauma, they said. The stress of the job finally getting to me. They suggested I take some time off, see a therapist. But I knew what I saw. The image of those faceless figures was burned into my mind, their impossible movements replaying every time I closed my eyes. The smell, that sickly sweet rot, seemed to linger in my nostrils no matter how much time passed. My colleagues treated me with a mixture of concern and wariness. I caught whispers, sideways glances. Poor Bram, they'd say, thinking I couldn't hear. Always was a bit intense, but now... The worst part was, I couldn't blame them. If one of them had come to me with a story like mine, I'd probably have reacted the same way. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to bear. The nightmares started about a week after the incident. Every night I'd find myself back in that clearing, surrounded by those faceless figures. Sometimes I was in the Jeep, trapped and helpless. Other times I was on foot, running through an endless forest where the trees seemed to move, blocking my path at every turn. And always, always there was that clicking sound, growing louder and louder until I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. I tried to go back to work after a couple of weeks, but it was useless. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow cast by the towering sequoias sent my pulse racing. I'd find myself reaching for my sidearm at the slightest provocation, jumping at sounds that used to be as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. It was clear to everyone, myself included, that I couldn't continue as a ranger. Not like this. So, with a heavy heart, I turned in my badge and uniform. 10 years of my life, a career I'd loved, all gone in the span of a few terrifying minutes in the woods. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I holed up in my cabin on the outskirts of the park, unable to bring myself to leave, but equally unable to step foot in the forest I'd once considered my second home. I drank too much, slept too little, and spent countless hours staring out the window, watching the tree line as if expecting those creatures to emerge at any moment. It was during one of these vigils, about a month after I'd quit my job, that I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was sitting on my porch, nursing a lukewarm beer and watching the sun set behind the trees, when movement caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe a bear, common enough sights in these parts. But as I focused, I realized it was something else entirely. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, was standing just at the edge of the clearing where my property met the forest. It was partially hidden behind a massive sequoia, but I could make out enough to know it was one of them. One of the things I'd seen that day in the woods. I froze, the beer bottle slipping from my numb fingers and shattering on the porch. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness of the evening. The figure's head turned towards me, that blank, featureless face somehow conveying a sense of curiosity or hunger. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Me, paralyzed with fear on my porch, and that thing, motionless at the edge of the woods. Then, with a movement that made my eyes water and my brain ache to process, it was gone. Not retreating into the woods, not walking away, just gone. There one moment and not the next, like a glitch in reality. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. As much as it pained me to leave the home I'd made for myself, the life I'd built, I knew that staying would mean either death or madness, probably both. The next morning, I packed up my old pickup truck with as much as I could fit and hit the road. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a desperate need to put as much distance between myself and Calaveras Big Trees State Park as possible. As I drove away, watching the massive sequoias recede in my rearview mirror, a part of me felt like I was running away, abandoning my post. But a larger part, the part that remembered the terror of that day and the horror of seeing that figure on the edge of my property, knew that this was survival. I drove for days, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to pull over at dingy motels or rest stops. I avoided wooded areas, sticking to open roads and treeless plains whenever possible. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico, that I finally felt far enough away to stop running. I found a cheap apartment in a bustling part of the city, as different from the quiet forests of California as I could manage. The constant noise of traffic, the press of people, the distinct lack of trees, it all helped to keep the memories at bay, at least during the daylight hours. But at night, when the city quieted and the shadows grew long, the memories would return. The nightmares continued, though less frequently. And sometimes when I looked out my window at the scrawny trees lining the street, I could swear I saw something moving among them, something tall and thin with skin like bark. Months passed, and slowly I began to rebuild some semblance of a life. I found work as a night security guard at a local shopping center. The job was mind-numbingly dull compared to my years as a ranger, but that was exactly what I needed. No surprises, no unexplained phenomena, just hours of patrolling well-lit corridors and watching grainy security camera feeds. But I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen in Calaveras. The more I tried to push it away, to convince myself it had all been some stress-induced hallucination, the more it nagged at me. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces that didn't fit. So, in my off hours, I began to research. At first, I stuck to official channels, park records, incident reports, local news archives. I was looking for anything unusual, any reports that might corroborate what I'd experienced. But there was nothing. Oh, there were the usual stories of lost hikers and animal attacks, but nothing that even hinted at the existence of the creatures I'd encountered. Frustrated but not deterred, I widened my search. I delved into folklore and mythology, poring over accounts of forest spirits and nature deities from cultures around the world. I joined online forums dedicated to cryptozoology and the paranormal, though I was careful never to share my own story. I wasn't ready for that level of scrutiny or potential ridicule. It was on one of these forums that I first came across the term woodwalkers. The post was buried deep in a thread about unexplained phenomena in national parks. And it was brief. Just a few lines from someone claiming their grandfather had encountered strange, tall figures in the forests of the Pacific Northwest back in the 1950s. The description matched what I'd seen almost perfectly. Unnaturally tall, skin like bark, moving in ways that defied human understanding. The poster said their grandfather had called them woodwalkers and believed they were ancient spirits tasked with protecting the oldest forests. My heart raced as I read and reread the post. It wasn't much, but it was the first piece of corroborating evidence I'd found. I wasn't alone. Someone else, somewhere, had seen these things. I reached out to the poster privately, hoping to learn more about their grandfather's experience. But my message went unanswered, and when I checked the forum a few days later, the entire account had been deleted. This setback only fueled my determination. I threw myself into my research with renewed vigor, spending every free moment hunting for more information about these woodwalkers. I ordered obscure books on forest lore, joined even more niche online communities, and even started learning Old Slavic, hoping to find untranslated accounts that might shed light on the creature I'd come to think of as the Leshy. My apartment slowly transformed into a cluttered research center. The walls were covered in maps, printouts of forum posts, and my own scribbled notes. Red strings connected seemingly unrelated pieces of information. A Himalayan legend here, a centuries-old account from the Black Forest there. To an outsider, it would have looked like the lair of a conspiracy theorist. Hell, sometimes I looked at it and thought I must be going crazy. But then I'd remember the smell of rotting wood and iron, the impossible movements of those figures, the antler I'd found in the clearing. And I knew with a certainty that terrified me that I wasn't crazy. This was real, and I needed to understand it. It was during this period of feverish research that I first noticed them. Small inconsistencies in my daily life. Objects not quite where I'd left them. The feeling of being watched when I was alone in my apartment. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I'd catch a glimpse of something tall and thin, there and gone so quickly I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Almost. I started taking precautions. I changed my routines, varied the routes I took to and from work. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, bought a white noise machine to help mask any unusual sounds at night. I even started carrying the antler I'd found in Calaveras with me everywhere I went, though I couldn't have explained why if you'd asked me. Despite my paranoia, or perhaps because of it, I managed to make a breakthrough in my research. An obscure journal from the late 1800s, written by a naturalist who'd spent time studying the redwood forests of Northern California, contained a passage that made my breath catch in my throat. There are things in these woods that defy explanation. Figures glimpsed between the trees, too tall and strange to be human. They move in ways that hurt the eye to follow, and where they walk, the very forest seems to shift and change. The locals whisper of guardian spirits, of ancient beings that protect the oldest trees, but in their eyes I see not reverence but fear. It wasn't much, but it was another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation that what I'd seen wasn't unique to me or to modern times. These things, whatever they were, had been around for a long time, but the more I uncovered, the more questions arose. What were these woodwalkers? Why had they shown themselves to me? And perhaps most pressingly, why did I have the increasing sense that they weren't content to stay in the forests anymore? As the summer heat of Albuquerque gave way to the cooler nights of autumn, I made a decision. It wasn't enough to research from afar. If I wanted answers, real answers, I needed to go back to where it all started. I needed to return to Calaveras Big Trees State Park. The drive back to California was a blur of anxiety and second-guessing. Every mile that brought me closer to Calaveras made my stomach churn with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I'd spent months running from this place, from the memories of what I'd seen here. Now I was willingly walking back into the lion's den. I arrived in the small town nearest to the park just as dusk was settling. The familiar silhouettes of the sequoias loomed on the horizon, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town, not ready to venture any closer to the park than necessary. The elderly woman at the front desk gave me a curious look as she handed over the key. "You here for the festival?" she asked. I blinked, confused. "Festival?" She nodded, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Oh yes, the Autumn Equinox Festival. It's quite the to-do. People come from all over to celebrate in the park. Dancing, music, all sorts of pagan-inspired rituals. All in good fun, of course." I managed a weak smile and a nod before retreating to my room. A festival. Hundreds of people venturing into the park, unaware of what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. The thought made me shudder. Sleep was elusive that night. I tossed and turned, my dreams a chaotic mix of faceless figures dancing around bonfires and antlered creatures stalking through moonlit groves. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat and with a sense of urgency I couldn't shake. I needed to get to the park. Now. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot at the park's main entrance. A few early risers were setting up booths and stages for the festival, but the park itself was still quiet. I sat in my truck for a long moment, staring at the trailhead that led into the towering sequoias. The forest seemed to loom larger than I remembered, the shadows between the massive trunks deeper and more menacing. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my backpack, stocked with water, trail mix, a first aid kit, and, somewhat foolishly, the antler I'd found all those months ago, and set out on the trail. The familiar sense of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils as I walked, bringing back a flood of memories. For a moment I could almost forget why I was here, could almost imagine I was just on another routine patrol. But then I heard it. A soft clicking sound, just at the edge of hearing. I froze, my heart pounding. It could have been anything. A woodpecker, branches rubbing together in the breeze. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it wasn't. They were here, watching, waiting. I pressed on, every sense hyper alert. The deeper I went into the park, the more oppressive the silence became. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the soft crunch of my boots on the forest floor and the increasingly loud pounding of my own heart. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green-tinted twilight beneath the sequoia's massive canopy. But eventually, I found myself in a small clearing, and there, in the center, stood a sight that made my blood run cold. It was a circle of those things, the woodwalkers as I'd come to call them. Tall, unnaturally thin figures with bark-like skin and blank, featureless faces. They stood motionless, their arms raised towards the canopy far above, and in the center of their circle was something else, a creature that seemed to be made of twisted branches and leaves, with a head adorned with antlers that branched and twisted impossibly. The Leshy. I stood at the edge of the clearing, paralyzed with fear and awe. I'd come looking for answers, but now that I was here, faced with the reality of these beings, I had no idea what to do. That's when the Leshy turned its head, if you could call it a head, towards me. There were no eyes that I could see, but I felt its gaze like a physical weight. And then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The voice was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A rustle of leaves, a creak of branches, the groan of wood in a high wind, all somehow forming words I could understand. "You have returned, Watcher," it said. "We have been waiting." The words hung in the air, seeming to reverberate through the clearing. I stood frozen, my mind racing to process what was happening. The Leshy, this impossible creature of branch and leaf, had spoken to me, and more than that, it had been expecting me. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. What do you say to an ancient forest spirit? Sorry I'm late? Nice antlers? In the end, all I managed was a hoarse whisper. What? What are you? The Leshy's head tilted, an eerily human gesture from such an inhuman form. We are the Old Ones, it said, its voice like wind through ancient boughs. Guardians of the deep places, keepers of the old ways. And you, Bram Hawthorne, are a watcher. I blinked, surprised to hear my name from this creature. A watcher? I don't understand. I'm just a park ranger. Or I was. A sound like creaking wood filled the clearing, and it took me a moment to realize it was laughter. You are more than you know, young one. The forest chose you, marked you. Why else do you think you were able to see us, to remember us when so many others forget? As the Leshy spoke, the woodwalkers began to move. Not the jarring, reality-bending movements I remembered from before, but a slow, swaying motion, like trees in a gentle breeze. It was hypnotic, almost soothing. But why me? I asked, finding my voice growing stronger. And why now? What's changed? The Leshy's form seemed to ripple, leaves and branches shifting in agitation. The balance is upset, it said, its voice now tinged with what I could only describe as concern. The old forests are dying, faster than ever before. Our strength wanes, and the hungry ones grow bold. The hungry ones, I repeated, a chill running down my spine. Those who would devour all, who see the forests only as resources to be consumed. They have always existed, but now they have new tools, new weapons. They tear into the earth, poison the air and water, and as the forests die, so do we. I thought of the logging operations I'd seen encroaching on the park's borders, the reports of illegal mining activities in protected areas. Was this what the Leshy meant? But what can I do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of what I was hearing. I'm just one person. The Leshy raised one of its branch-like arms, pointing at me. You are a watcher. Your eyes have been opened to our world. You can see what others cannot. Speak for those who have no voice in your world. And most importantly, you can warn others. Warn them. About what? The clearing suddenly grew darker, the shadows between the trees deepening. The woodwalkers swaying became more agitated, their clicking sounds growing louder. A great darkness approaches, the Leshy said, its voice now a low rumble that I felt in my bones. The hungry ones plan to strike at the heart of this forest. If they succeed, the consequences will reach far beyond these trees. The balance that has existed for millennia will be shattered. Images flashed through my mind. Great machines tearing through the forest, fires consuming ancient sequoias, the land left barren and lifeless. I didn't know if these visions were my own imagination or something the Leshy was projecting into my mind, but they filled me with a sense of dread and urgency. "The festival," I said suddenly, remembering why I'd come here in the first place. "Is that why you let me see you before? To warn me about this?" The Leshy nodded, a slow, ponderous movement. "The autumn equinox, a time when the veil between worlds thins, when old magics stir. The Hungry Ones plan to use the festival as cover for their true intentions. They will strike when the moon is highest, seeking to tap into powers they do not understand." I took a deep breath, trying to process everything I was hearing. It all sounded insane. Ancient forest spirits, dark rituals, a threat to the very balance of nature. And yet standing here in this clearing, surrounded by impossible beings, I couldn't deny the truth of it. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. The Leshy's form seemed to grow larger, more imposing. "You must stop them, Watcher. Find their agents among the festival goers. Prevent their ritual. And if you cannot, you must be prepared to awaken the heart of the forest." "Awaken the heart? What does that mean?" But the Leshy was already beginning to fade, its form becoming transparent, merging with the shadows of the forest. The woodwalkers, too, were disappearing, their tall forms blending seamlessly with the trunks of the sequoias. "Seek the oldest tree," the Leshy's voice whispered, now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "When the time comes, you will know what to do." And then they were gone. The clearing was empty, silent save for the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood there for a long moment, my mind reeling from what had just transpired. I had come seeking answers, and instead, I had been given a mission, a responsibility I wasn't sure I was ready for. But as I looked around at the towering sequoias, these ancient giants that had stood watch for thousands of years, I knew I couldn't walk away. Whatever was coming, whatever threat these Hungry Ones posed, I had to try to stop it. Not just for the sake of the forest or the mysterious beings that called it home, but for all of us. Because somehow, I knew that the Leshy was right. If this forest fell, the consequences would reach far beyond these trees. With a deep breath, I shouldered my pack and turned back towards the trail. I had work to do, and not much time to do it. The festival would be starting soon, and somewhere among the revelers and tourists, the agents of destruction were waiting to make their move. It was time for this Watcher to live up to his name. The Autumn Equinox Festival was in full swing by the time I made it back to the main area of the park. The once quiet trails were now bustling with activity, filled with tourists, locals, and what seemed like an endless parade of vendors and performers. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a joyous scene. Booths lined the paths, selling everything from handcrafted jewelry to organic, locally sourced foods. A stage had been set up in a large clearing, where musicians played upbeat folk tunes that had festival-goers dancing with carefree abandon. Children ran about with faces painted to resemble forest creatures, their laughter mixing with the music and the general buzz of conversation. But after my encounter with the Leshy, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that hung over everything. Every smiling face now seemed to hide potential malice. Every group huddled in conversation could be plotting the forest's destruction. I made my way through the crowd, eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. But what exactly was I looking for? The Leshy hadn't given me much to go on. Agents of the Hungry Ones could mean anything. Corporate representatives, corrupt officials, or something far more sinister. As I pondered this, a commotion near one of the food stalls caught my attention. A man was arguing heatedly with one of the vendors, his voice rising above the general din of the festival. "What do you mean you won't accept cash?" the man was saying, his face red with anger. "It's legal tender." The vendor, a young woman with flowers braided into her hair, was trying to calm him down. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're a cashless event. It's all done through the festival app. I thought everyone was informed when they bought tickets." "App? I don't need any damn app. I've been coming to this forest since before you were born, Missy. Never needed an app to buy a sandwich before." I watched the exchange with growing unease. On the surface, it seemed like a simple misunderstanding, the kind of thing that happens at any large event. But something about the man's demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. He was dressed like any other tourist: cargo shorts, hiking boots, a faded t-shirt with a logo I didn't recognize. But his anger seemed disproportionate to the situation, and there was something in his eyes, a coldness that didn't match his heated words. I edged closer, pretending to be interested in the menu displayed at the stall. "Look," the man was saying now, his voice lowered but still intense. "Just take the money. No one has to know. It's not like the trees care how we pay, right?" The vendor shook her head firmly. "I'm sorry, but I can't. It's not just about payment. It's about tracking sales for sustainability purposes. The park uses the data too." "Sustainability?" the man scoffed. "Please. You think a few paper bills are going to hurt this place more than all these people trampling around? This whole festival is a joke. If you really cared about the forest, you'd shut it all down." As he spoke, I noticed something fall from his pocket. It looked like a small vial filled with a dark liquid. Without thinking, I bent down to pick it up. "Excuse me, sir," I said, holding out the vial. "You dropped this?" The man whirled to face me, and for a split second I saw something flash in his eyes. Recognition? Fear? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a fake smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, thank you," he said, snatching the vial from my hand. "Just some medicine for my allergies." I nodded, feigning belief. "Allergies can be rough, especially out here in nature. Say, this is my first time at the festival. Any recommendations on what I should check out?" The man's demeanor changed instantly. The anger was gone, replaced by an almost eager helpfulness. "Oh, you're in for a treat," he said. "The real action happens after dark, though. There's a special ceremony at midnight, deep in the grove of the oldest trees. Very exclusive. If you're interested, meet me back here just before 11. I might be able to get you in." With that, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing there with a mixture of dread and anticipation. I had no doubt that this was exactly the kind of thing the Leshy had warned me about. But now that I'd found it, what was I supposed to do? I spent the next few hours wandering the festival, keeping an eye out for the man or anyone else who seemed out of place. I saw a few other heated exchanges, heard whispered conversations that cut off abruptly when I approached. It was clear that whatever was going to happen tonight, there were multiple players involved. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the towering sequoias, I felt a change come over the festival. The family-friendly atmosphere of the day gave way to something more primal, more in tune with the ancient forest around us. Bonfires were lit in clearings, their flames casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. The music changed, too, becoming more rhythmic, almost hypnotic. I made my way back to the food stall where I'd encountered the man earlier. He was already there, standing with a small group of people who all shared that same cold look in their eyes. "Ah, there you are," he said as I approached. "Ready for a real equinox experience?" I nodded, trying to look eager rather than terrified. "Lead the way." As we set off down a dimly lit trail, away from the main festival area, I couldn't help but feel like I was walking into the belly of the beast. Whatever was going to happen tonight, I was about to be right in the middle of it. I just hoped I was ready for what I might find. The small group I had joined moved silently through the darkening forest, our path lit only by the occasional flicker of handheld lanterns. The festive sounds of the main celebration grew fainter with each step, replaced by the eerie quiet of the deep woods. Even the normal nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. I tried to memorize the route we were taking, but after several twists and turns, I had to admit I was thoroughly lost. The man who had invited me, I still didn't know his name, led the way with confident strides, never hesitating at a fork in the path or pausing to check his bearings. Wherever we were going, he knew exactly how to get there. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 45 minutes, we emerged into a massive clearing. At its center stood the largest sequoia I had ever seen. Its trunk was so wide that it would have taken at least 20 people linking hands to encircle it, and its top was lost in the darkness above, reaching towards the star-studded sky. "The heart," our guide announced, his voice filled with a reverence that sent chills down my spine. "The oldest living thing in this forest, perhaps in the world. Tonight we awaken its true power." As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized we weren't alone in the clearing. Dozens of other people were already there, arranging themselves in a large circle around the massive tree. Many were dressed in dark robes, their faces obscured by deep hoods. Others wore business attire, incongruous in this wild setting. At the base of the great sequoia, a small group was setting up what looked like scientific equipment. Computers, strange sensors attached to the tree's bark, and in the center, a large device that hummed with barely contained energy. "What exactly are we doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. A woman to my left answered, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling fervor. "We're going to tap into the power that flows through this ancient being. Do you have any idea how much energy is contained in a tree this old, this massive? It's not just about the wood or the carbon. There's something more, something primordial." "And what will you do with this energy?" I pressed, dreading the answer. "Change the world," our guide said simply. "Imagine having access to a power source that dwarfs anything we've ever known. We could revolutionize industry, transform technology. The applications are endless." "And what happens to the tree, to the forest?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Progress requires sacrifice. This forest has stood for millennia. It's time it gave something back to humanity." As he spoke, the humming from the central device grew louder. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with an energy I could almost taste. The robed figures began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, their voices rising and falling in an otherworldly rhythm. I knew I had to act, to do something to stop this. But I was just one person, unarmed, surrounded by dozens of others who would undoubtedly try to stop me if I made a move against their equipment. That's when I remembered the Leshy's words. "When the time comes, you will know what to do." Almost without conscious thought, my hand went to my pocket, where I had stowed the antler I'd found all those months ago. As my fingers touched it, I felt a jolt of energy race up my arm. Suddenly, I knew exactly what I had to do. With a swift movement that surprised even me, I pulled out the antler and lunged towards the heart tree. Shouts of alarm rose behind me, but I was already pressing the antler against the ancient bark. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. A blinding light erupted from the point where antler met tree, accompanied by a sound like the world itself was groaning. The ground beneath our feet shuddered and heaved, and then to my utter astonishment, the tree began to move. Massive roots tore themselves from the earth, showering dirt and rocks in all directions. The trunk twisted and bent in ways that wood should not be able to move. And high above, branches thick as houses began to sway and reach. The heart was awakening, and it was angry. Chaos erupted in the clearing. The robed figures scattered, their chants forgotten in their panic. I saw the scientific equipment crushed beneath writhing roots, sparks flying as delicate machinery was destroyed. In the midst of the chaos, I caught sight of our guide, the man who had led us here. He was shouting orders, trying to salvage some of the equipment. His eyes met mine, and I saw fury there mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps. Or maybe recognition. "You!" he snarled, pointing at me. "What have you done?" I opened my mouth to respond, but my words were drowned out by a deafening crack. The great sequoia, the heart, was splitting open. But instead of wood and sap, blinding light poured from the fissure, and from that light emerged a figure. It was the Leshy, but not as I had seen it before. Now it stood easily 30 feet tall, its body a swirling mass of leaves, branches, and pure energy. Antlers of blazing light crowned its head, and its eyes, for now it had eyes, burned with an ancient, terrible wisdom. "Enough!" it thundered, its voice shaking the very air. Everything stopped. The chaos, the panic, even the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The Leshy's gaze swept over the clearing, lingering on each person in turn. When it reached me, I felt a warmth spread through my body, a sense of rightness and purpose. "You who would violate this sacred place," the Leshy spoke, its voice somehow both a whisper and a roar. "You who would drain the lifeblood of the forest for your own gain, you know not what forces you tamper with." Our guide, seemingly emboldened by desperation, stepped forward. "We seek only to harness the power that lies dormant here," he said. "Think of the good we could do, the advancements we could make." The Leshy's laugh was like an earthquake. "Power? You understand nothing of true power. The forest is not a resource to be drained, but a living entity to be respected. It is the breath of the world, the memory of ages, and it is not defenseless." As if in response to the Leshy's words, the trees around us creaked and groaned. Roots erupted from the earth, wrapping around the feet of those who had come to exploit the forest. Branches reached down, plucking up the equipment and crushing it effortlessly. "Please," the guide begged, his bravado gone. "We didn't know. We'll leave, we promise. Just let us go." The Leshy was silent for a long moment, its form shifting and swirling. Then it turned to me. "Watcher," it said, its voice gentler now but no less powerful. "What say you? These ones came to destroy. Should they not reap what they have sown?" I felt the weight of every eye in the clearing upon me. This, I realized, was why I had been chosen. Not just to warn or to fight, but to judge. I took a deep breath, looking around at the terrified faces of those who, moments ago, had been so eager to exploit this ancient place. "They should face justice," I said finally. "But not here. Not like this. Let the human world deal with them, and let them live with the knowledge of what they've seen, of the power they can never hope to control." The Leshy nodded slowly. "Mercy," it said, "is a rare thing in this world. Very well, it shall be as you say." With a gesture, the Leshy commanded the trees to release their captives. Roots sank back into the earth, branches retreated to the canopy above. "Go," the Leshy commanded, "and know that you walk free only by the grace of the Watcher. Should you ever return with ill intent, the forest will not be so forgiving." The clearing emptied quickly, people fleeing into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of their ambitions. Soon only I remained, standing before the towering form of the Leshy. "You have done well, Watcher," it said, "but your task is not yet complete." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Isn't it over?" The Leshy's form began to shrink, condensing back into the more human-sized version I had first encountered. "This was but one battle in a long war," it said. "The hungry ones will not give up so easily, and there are other forests, other ancient places that need protection." I felt a mix of emotions wash over me: exhaustion, exhilaration, and a growing sense of purpose. "What would you have me do?" "Travel," the Leshy said. "Learn. There are others like you out there, watchers who have yet to awaken to their true purpose. Find them, teach them, create a network of guardians to stand watch over the wild places of the world." As it spoke, images flashed through my mind. Dense rainforests, wind-swept tundra, sun-baked deserts. In each I saw figures much like myself, standing at the border between civilization and wilderness. "It won't be easy," I said, more to myself than to the Leshy. "Few things of value are," it replied. "But you will not be alone. The spirits of the wild places will aid you, as will the woodwalkers, and you will always have a home here, in this forest that has claimed you as its own." With those words, the Leshy began to fade, its form becoming transparent and merging with the great sequoia behind it. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke one last time. "Remember, Bram Hawthorne, you are the watcher in the woods, the guardian of the wild, the voice for those who cannot speak. Go now and fulfill your destiny." And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the clearing with the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. As I made my way back towards the main area of the park, my mind was reeling with everything that had happened. The festival goers would be waking up soon, nursing hangovers and sharing stories of the wild party the night before. They would have no idea of the battle that had been fought, of the ancient powers that had awakened. But I knew. And I knew that my life would never be the same. As I reached the edge of the forest, I turned back for one last look. For a moment, I thought I saw a tall, thin figure standing between the trees, its bark-like skin blending perfectly with the sequoias, a woodwalker watching over its domain. I nodded in acknowledgement, then turned and walked into the brightening day. I had a lot of work to do, and a whole world of forests to protect. The adventure, it seemed, was just beginning. 1 year later. The campfire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. Around it sat a small group of people, their faces flickering in the firelight. To a casual observer, they might have looked like any group of campers enjoying a night in the wilderness. But these were no ordinary campers, and this was no ordinary camping trip. I looked around at the faces of my companions. Sarah, the marine biologist who had encountered selkies off the coast of Scotland. Miguel, the former logger whose chainsaw had been stopped by an invisible force in the Amazon. Aiko, the tech entrepreneur who had seen Kodama in a Japanese forest and abandoned her plans for a new data center. They were watchers, like me, awakened to the hidden world that existed alongside our own, sworn to protect the wild places and the ancient beings that dwelled within them. "All right," I said, leaning forward. "Who wants to go first tonight?" Sarah cleared her throat. "I've been monitoring the activity off the coast of Nova Scotia," she began. "There's been an increase in unexplained sonar readings. I think the deep ones might be on the move." Miguel nodded grimly. "Similar story in the Andes. The mountain spirits are restless. Something's coming, but I can't figure out what." As the others shared their reports, I couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in a year. After my experience in Calaveras, I had done as the Leshy instructed. I traveled, seeking out others who had glimpsed the hidden world. Some I found through whispered rumors and legends. Others found me, drawn by some instinct they couldn't explain. We formed a network, a loose alliance of guardians watching over the world's wild places. We shared information, supported each other, and when necessary, intervened to prevent exploitation or destruction of sacred sites. It wasn't easy. We faced skepticism, ridicule, and sometimes outright hostility. There were times when I questioned everything, wondered if I was just chasing shadows and myths. But then I would feel the weight of the antler in my pocket, my totem, my connection to the Leshy and the forest that had awakened me. And I would remember. The world was stranger and more wonderful than most people could imagine, and it was our job to keep it that way. As the night wore on and plans were made, I found myself gazing into the fire, my thoughts drifting back to that night in Calaveras. The Leshy, the woodwalkers, the heart tree coming to life. It all seemed like a dream now. But the lessons I had learned, the responsibility I had accepted, those were very real. I was no longer just Bram Hawthorne, former park ranger. I was a watcher, a guardian of the wild, a protector of ancient secrets. And as I looked around at my companions, this odd, brave group of misfits who had answered the same call, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The fire burned low, and one by one my fellow watchers drifted off to their tents, but I remained, keeping vigil as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. In the distance, I heard a sound, a soft clicking, like branches knocking together in a breeze. I smiled, knowing that we were not alone in our watch. The woodwalkers were out there, as were countless other beings of myth and legend. And as long as there were wild places left in the world, we would be there to protect them.